Hello, my friend. Come on in and get comfortable. I hope your evening has finally slowed down. Maybe you're already under the covers, phone propped against a pillow. Maybe you just finished the dishes, and this is the very first quiet minute you have had all day. Or maybe you are somewhere in between, not quite ready for sleep, but not really awake either. That soft in-between place. If that is you, you are exactly where you need to be tonight. Because tonight we're travelling back more than 500 years to a quiet stone room in England, where a young woman stands completely alone in front of a bishop sent to end her marriage before the world even learns it happened. She has no lawyer, no father beside her, only 2 words, once whispered to a man her family considered far beneath her. By the end of tonight, you will understand why those 2 words turned out to be stronger than her entire family. Before we step inside that room with her, let me ask you something. Where are you settling in from tonight? What time is it right there where you are? Wrapped up and ready to disappear into someone else's story for a while. If evenings like this one have become a small habit of yours alike, or a quick comment means more than you would probably guess, tell me your city, your country, the hour on your clock right now. I love picturing all of you out there, scattered across 100 different time zones, drifting off to this very same slow, quiet story. All right, get cozy. Maybe turn the lamp down low or let a fan hum softly somewhere in the room. And let's step back together into the cold, candlelit world of medieval England. Norfolk sits low against the sky in the eastern curve of England, where the land goes flat and quiet, where slow rivers cut through the fields and cold air off the coast never really stops moving through the reeds. Picture timber manor houses ringed by shallow moats, smoke curling up from a single chimney, geese complaining somewhere near the gate cart tracks frozen hard into the mud after a long night's frost. It is not a grand world, not the kind you would find in a painting of a royal court. It is a working one built out of grain stores, rent books, and longed, cold rides between one property and the next. In the year 1469, this was Paston country. Now, if you've never heard the name Paston before, that is completely fine. They were not royalty. They were not the kind of family whose portraits hang in famous halls. They were something almost more interesting, a family of small landowners, clawing their way up from ordinary beginnings into the ranks of the gentry, one contract and one lawsuit at a time. And the reason we know so much about them today, more than 5 centuries later, comes down to something wonderfully ordinary. They wrote letters, hundreds of them. Letters about rent and roofs and marriages and grief tucked away in trunks and somehow surviving centuries of fires, floods and forgetfulness. Historians now simply call them the Paston Letters, and they remain one of the closest things we have to eavesdropping on a real medieval family's private life. No court chronicler polished these pages for an audience. These people had no idea we would ever be reading over their shoulders. For centuries, those letters simply sat in private hands, passed down half forgotten, until they were finally gathered and published long after everyone involved had turned to dust. Which means every private argument, every worried request for money, every small family scandal we are about to talk about, was never meant to become public reading material at all. We're essentially holding someone else's old family mail, and tonight we're about to open one of the most personal envelopes in the entire collection. At the centre of our story tonight is a young woman named Marjorie Paston. By 1469, Marjorie was about 20 years old, which by the standards of her time and her class made her something close to a problem. Not because anything was wrong with her. Quite the opposite. She came from a family that, thanks largely to her mother's sharp mind, controlled several manors across the county. In a world where marriage was first and foremost a business deal between 2 households, Marjorie should have been a fairly easy match, except she was not. Her family had already gone through more than one round of marriage negotiations on her behalf. Suitors had been proposed, terms had been discussed, argued over and quietly dropped. Again and again. The deals had fallen apart, usually over money. The same way so many medieval matches quietly collapsed long before anyone reached the church door. Every year that passed without a ring made Marjorie a little more anxious and quietly, made her family a little more embarrassed. Meanwhile, running steadily in the background of the entire Paston household was a man named Richard Carler. Richard was not a Paston by blood. He was their bailiff, which is simply a medieval way of saying he was the person who actually kept the household from falling apart. He collected the rents. He managed the tenants. He rode from manor to manor in every kind of weather, settling disputes, chasing down debts, keeping the accounts straight, while the family argued, litigated, and more than once defended their own walls against armed men trying to seize their land. If you're picturing something quiet and dusty, think again. Managing a family like the Pastons in the 1400s was closer to running a small, chaotic company with occasional siege warfare mixed in. Margaret Paston, Marjorie's mother, had already held one of their manors under actual armed attack, directing the household's defence herself while her husband was away in London untangling yet another lawsuit. That same year, 1469, one of the family's own castles would come under siege again, and Richard Carler was right there among the men helping to hold it. He was not some background clerk hunched over a desk. He was the man the Pastons trusted with money, with secrets, and when it came down to it, with their own physical safety. Except, as it turned out, he was not supposed to be trusted with Marjorie's heart, because somewhere between the rent collections and the ledgers, somewhere between years of simply being present in the same halls, at the same long tables, going over the same lists of tenants who owed grain or coin, something had quietly grown between them. He would have been the one who taught her, without ever meaning to how the household really worked, which fields owed what, which tenants could be trusted, which storm-damaged roof needed fixing before the winter rains came through it. She would have been the one who watched him do it day after day, season after season, while suitor after suitor came and went and never stayed. There is something quietly intimate about that kind of closeness, the kind built not from grand gestures but from simply being useful to each other, over and over in 100 small unglamorous ways. We do not know the exact moment it happened. The letters frustratingly stay silent on that part. But historians studying the Pastons generally agree it likely began when Marjorie was around 20, old enough, as one historian dryly put it, to have a mind of her own. And this is where it is worth pausing for a moment, because here is the detail that tends to surprise people the most. In medieval England, the church did not actually require a large wedding, a priest witnesses or anyone's blessing at all, for a marriage to count. If two people of a reasonable age freely spoke the right words to each other, meaning in plain terms, something like "I take you as my wife and I take you as my husband," spoken and meant in that moment, that alone was considered a real binding, sacred marriage in the eyes of the church. Priests preferred a public ceremony, of course. Families expected one. But the marriage itself at its legal core belonged to the two people saying the words, not to whoever happened to be standing around them. No family required, no ceremony, no witnesses, just words, which means that somewhere quietly away from Margaret's watchful eye, away from the ledgers and the rent collectors, Marjorie Paston and Richard Carle appear to have done exactly that, perhaps in a quiet corner of the manor after the household had gone to bed, perhaps somewhere out among the barns and the stored grain where a bailiff would have every reason to be, and no one would think twice about a young woman finding an excuse to be there too. However it happened, they exchanged those words with each other, privately, almost certainly with no one else present, and no one else's permission. At the time it must have felt less like a legal maneuver and more like a promise between two people who'd simply run out of patience waiting for the world to give them permission on its own. For a while it stayed their secret. Then in the spring of 1469 it did not. We do not know exactly how Margaret Paston found out. Her own letters only hint at it, vaguely, almost as if she could not bring herself to write the details down. What we do know is that once she did find out, the reaction was immediate, and it was furious. To Margaret and to Marjorie's brothers, this was not a romance. This was a disaster. Richard Carl, however capable, however deeply trusted, came from a family of shopkeepers. His people sold candles and mustard for a living back in their hometown. To a family as anxious about their social standing as the Pastons, a family still fighting to be taken seriously among older, more established gentry, this felt almost worse than if Marjorie had run off with no one at all. One of Marjorie's own brothers did not hold back. In a letter to his sibling, he sneered that if their sister truly married Richard Carley, she might as well spend the rest of her days selling candles and mustard in the marketplace herself. It is honestly a little bit funny in a bitter sort of way. More than 500 years later, and we're still watching families lose their minds over a partner they have decided is simply not good enough. Some things apparently never really change, they just trade a bishop's chamber for a tense family group chat. Only back then the stakes were not an awkward conversation at a family dinner. They were the entire reputation of the household. Margaret's next move was calculated. Letters between Richard and Marjorie were quietly intercepted. Nearly all of them were destroyed deliberately, one by one, until only a single letter from Richard to Marjorie survived at all. Tucked away almost by accident, the last fragile thread connecting two people, the family was determined to pull apart. And then Margaret did something that tells you exactly how seriously she took this. She had her own daughter brought before the Bishop of Norwich. Now this was not simply a scolding session. Under church law, if a couple claimed to have exchanged marriage vows privately, and one side later wanted to deny it, the matter could be brought to an ecclesiastical court, and a bishop of all people could be asked to determine whether a real marriage had actually taken place. In a strange way, Margaret was gambling on the very same law she hoped would set her daughter free. So picture the scene: a young woman barely 20 standing in a cold stone chamber, candlelight catching the folds of a bishop's robe, her own breath probably visible in the winter air. The room hushed, official, entirely unfamiliar. No mother beside her this time, no brother, just her, and a man whose only job that day was to make her take her words back. She's been sent there quite deliberately by her own family to unravel a promise made in private, between two people in a place where no one else was supposed to be listening at all. He questioned her closely, apparently more than once. According to her mother's own account, he reminded Marjorie plainly exactly what she stood to lose: her family, her name, her place within a household that had spent generations trying to climb higher than the one before it. He reminded her that if she simply denied it, if she claimed the words had never truly been spoken as a real marriage vow, all of that could still belong to her. All she had to do was say she had lied, and Marjorie did not. Instead, by every account that survives, she calmly repeated back to the bishop exactly what had passed between herself and Richard. The words, the intention behind them, the plain fact that as far as she understood it, and as far as the church's own law defined it, she was already his wife. And here is the part that must have infuriated her family most of all. Under the very same church law her own mother was relying on to punish her, Marjorie happened to be right. The Bishop of Norwich, bound by the doctrine of his own church, had no real choice in the matter. Consent freely given and clearly meant was consent. It did not matter that no family member had witnessed it. It did not matter that Margaret Paston, a woman with land money and considerable influence, wanted a different answer. The law belonged to the church, not to the Pastons, and the church's law said Marjorie had told the truth. Their marriage stood. It is easy looking back from where we sit now, centuries later, to imagine this as some grand romantic triumph, and in a quiet way it truly was. But it also came at a real cost. For a time, Marjorie found herself cut off from the very family that had raised her. There is no record of a warm homecoming, no sign her mother softened quickly. The wedding she finally had with Richard was small and plain, nothing like the elaborate match her family had once hoped to arrange for her. There was no fortune waiting for them, no manor handed down as a gift. What they had instead was each other and a piece of church law that no amount of family fury could undo. They stayed married for roughly a decade until Marjorie's death. Whatever scandal surrounded its beginning, by most accounts theirs became quietly an ordinary settled household, of the kind that rarely makes it into any history book at all, which is, in its own way, exactly the point. Nobody writes ballads about a marriage that simply lasts. History tends to remember the fight at the beginning, and forget the years of ordinary life that came quietly afterward. The shared meals, the shared work, the slow, unremarkable proof that she had chosen correctly after all. And maybe that is precisely why this particular story has survived tucked inside a bundle of 500-year-old letters, while so many other medieval marriages arranged negotiated entirely forgettable, simply faded into the record books and disappeared without a trace. Because underneath all that talk of dowries and land and family honour, medieval marriage carried a strange, quiet loophole running right through the middle of it, a loophole that belonged in the end, not to fathers, not to mothers, not even to bishops, but to the two people standing in the room, saying the words themselves. In some ways it was easier to start a medieval marriage than it was to legally undo one, which is not exactly the story most of us were taught. We tend to imagine our own courthouse weddings and quiet elopements as a distinctly modern invention, two people slipping away from disapproving relatives to make a decision entirely their own. Marjorie and Richard remind us that particular impulse is not new at all, only their version required no marriage license, no witnesses signing a certificate, no clerk stamping a form. It required nothing more than honesty spoken once and meant. And Marjorie Paston is far from the only medieval woman whose life runs headfirst into that loophole, because as it turns out the idea that medieval women had no say at all in who they married, that they were simply handed off silent and powerless from one household to the next, is not nearly as true as most of us grew up believing. There was an entire hidden culture of courtship running quietly underneath medieval society, one with its own rules, its own etiquette and its own surprising amount of freedom, especially for the women who were not the daughters of ambitious families like the Pastons. And that is exactly where we are headed next. Let's take apart a picture that most of us are carrying around without even realizing it. Close your eyes for a second if you can do that and still keep listening. Now imagine a medieval girl's daily life. What do you see? Probably something like this. A young woman confined to her father's house, watched every waking hour, allowed almost no contact with young men at all, until one single day her father simply hands her over to a husband. She barely knows a stranger chosen entirely without her. It is a vivid picture. It shows up in films, in novels, in half of what gets repeated online as settled historical fact, usually with a castle in the background and a resigned bride staring out a window. It is also for the vast majority of medieval women almost entirely wrong. Here is the detail that tends to catch people off guard the most. Church law technically allowed girls to marry as young as 12. That part is true, and it should sound uncomfortable to modern ears, because it was by any standard we would recognize today. But a legal minimum age is not the same thing as an average age, and when historians actually dig through the surviving records, tax rolls, court cases, guild registers, wage lists, an entirely different picture starts to emerge. Across much of late medieval England, ordinary working women were commonly reaching their mid-20s before they married at all. Sit with that for a moment, because it rarely makes it into the popular version of this story. Not 14, not 16, often closer to 25, sometimes later. So what exactly was a young woman doing with all those years in between childhood and marriage? This is where the locked-away maiden falls apart completely, because the honest answer is she was almost certainly out working, living somewhere other than her parents' house, earning her own coin. Across much of medieval England, it was entirely ordinary for a girl to leave her family's home around the age of 12 or 13, not to be married off, but to be sent into what historians call service, working in someone else's household. She might scrub floors, mind young children, help run a busy kitchen, or spend years learning a trade alongside a master craftsman's family in a completely different town. She earned her own small wage, however modest. She lived under someone else's roof, following someone else's rules, certainly, but she was no longer living under her own father's direct watch either. Picture that for a second, because if this is being turned into images at all, this is worth lingering on. A girl of 12 or 13, everything she owns bundled into a sack, walking sometimes for days along a muddy road toward a town she has never once seen to work for a family she has never met. That is not confinement. If anything, measured against the standards of her own century, that is something closer to the beginning of an independent life. These service arrangements were not usually meant to last forever either. Many were agreed a year at a time, sometimes renewed, sometimes not, which meant a young woman really could and often did leave one household for a better pay, kinder employers, a nicer town, an entirely different trade to learn. Historians studying towns such as York have found record after record of young women moving through several such positions before ever settling down, following opportunity the same restless way a person might change jobs today. It was not glamorous work. It was by every account hard, tiring, and occasionally lonely, especially in that first winter, away from a family a girl had known her whole life, but it was hers to manage and hers to walk away from in a way that simply does not fit the picture of a passive, powerless medieval daughter. There is even a term historians use for women in exactly this position: unmarried adult living and working independently of any father or husband. Single women treated in the eyes of the law as capable of holding their own wages, renting their own small room, answering for their own debts. Some of the larger towns of late medieval England, London especially, had so many of these women living and working within their walls that a few historians have gone as far as calling this stretch of the period something close to a golden age for urban women, at least compared to the centuries that followed it. That is not a phrase historians use lightly, and it comes with plenty of caveats, but it should tell you something: that the least romantic, least discussed corner of medieval life, ordinary working women simply managing their own affairs, is exactly the corner that keeps overturning what we assume we already know. None of it was easy, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Homesickness was real, so was loneliness, especially through a first winter spent among strangers in a house that was not yet home, surrounded by people who were at best still learning to trust her. But loneliness and confinement are not the same thing, and it is worth being careful not to confuse the two, the way popular imagination so often does. And once she arrived in that new household, in that unfamiliar town, something else happened almost automatically. She met people, constantly, other servants under the same roof, apprentices next door, young men delivering goods, mending fences, working the same market stalls 3 streets over. Courtship, real courtship, did not happen behind locked doors in medieval England. It happened almost entirely out in the open, woven into the ordinary business of simply getting through a day. The church steps after a service. The well where half the young women in a neighbourhood ended up hauling water at roughly the same hour every single morning, trading news along with the buckets. Market day, when the whole town spilled into the streets at once, stalls crowded shoulder to shoulder, everyone with somewhere to be and someone to notice along the way. Harvest weeks, when unmarried men and women worked side by side in the same fields, from dawn until the light gave out hands, raw backs aching, and somehow still finding the energy afterward to linger a little longer than the work strictly required. None of these were romantic settings by design. They were simply where daily life happened. And daily life, it turns out, is exactly where courtship has always taken root in every century, including this one. Try to picture an ordinary Tuesday in a modest English market town sometime in that same century. Stalls set up before sunrise, the smell of bread and wood smoke drifting between them. Chickens loudly objecting to their own crates. A young serving woman sent out with a basket and a short list of errands finds herself lingering a moment too long at a glover's stall, not because she especially needs new gloves, but because the young man selling them keeps finding small reasons to keep the conversation going. Nobody would have called that a date. Nobody used a word like that at all. But strip away the century, and it is difficult to argue it was anything else. A small gift might change hands eventually, a ribbon, a carved wooden comb, a handful of early apples. Nothing extravagant, simply proof that someone had been thinking of someone else. We will come back to exactly what those small gifts meant, and how seriously medieval people took them a little later in this story. For now, it is enough to notice that the scene itself would not feel entirely foreign even now. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If courtship back then was this public, this visible, practically performed in front of the entire community, what do you imagine that did to the relationship itself? Did an audience like that make falling for someone easier with half the street quietly keeping score? Or did it make the whole thing far more nerve-wracking than anything most of us deal with today? Because that public quality was never incidental. It mattered enormously, especially later once things went wrong between a couple. When historians study old church court records, the kind used to settle disputes over whether a marriage had actually taken place, one detail comes up again and again. Neighbours were pulled in as witnesses, and they remembered an astonishing amount of specific, ordinary detail. Who had sat beside whom at whose hearth on a particular evening? Who had shared a cup of ale or exchanged a ring or a pair of gloves? Who had half-joking been overheard calling each other husband and wife long before any formal ceremony took place? Picture a neighbour standing before a church official describing entirely from memory the exact bench a couple had shared 3 winters earlier and being taken seriously as a legal witness for doing exactly that. None of it was private in the way we now assume romance ought to be private. It was witnessed. It was gossiped about. It was in its own quiet way community property. There is something almost funny about that if you look at it from a modern angle. We tend to imagine our own dating lives as intensely private, something between 2 people, and maybe a phone screen late at night. Medieval courtship ran on something closer to the exact opposite. It functioned like a village-wide group chat that never had an off switch, except instead of typed messages, it was every neighbour at the well, every worshipper filing out of church on a Sunday, quietly keeping track of who was walking home with whom, and drawing their own conclusions long before the couple involved had settled anything for themselves. No one needed to screenshot a conversation to hold someone accountable to their own words. An entire village already remembered them sometimes better than the couple themselves did. And there was rarely one single chaperone hovering over every conversation, the way we sometimes picture it. Some stern aunt permanently stationed 3 steps behind every young couple. It was something looser, and honestly a little more effective, an entire neighbourhood half paying attention at any given moment, which added up to something like constant supervision without any one person ever having to be formally in charge of it. Nobody needed to assign the job. Curiosity did it for free, in a strange way that made real privacy nearly impossible, and it also made a certain kind of protection nearly automatic. A young woman being courted openly in full view of her whole village was far harder to mistreat or quietly abandon or lie to than one meeting someone in complete secrecy. The entire community was, whether it meant to or not, functioning as a built-in witness to every promise made. It is worth pausing here to ask yourself something else. Would you have wanted that kind of built-in audience for your own early relationships? Every awkward first conversation, every small disagreement playing out in front of people who would remember it for decades. Some of us would probably have hated it. Others honestly might have appreciated never having to wonder where they truly stood with someone, since half the village would have told them anyway. Now this is where the picture gets a little more complicated and honestly a little more human, because not every part of medieval courtship was gentle or entirely safe, and it certainly was not as buttoned up as later, more prudish centuries like to imagine. The same church that publicly expected chastity before marriage also in quiet practice tolerated a surprising amount of grey area. Once a couple had exchanged what were considered words of future consent, essentially an informal promise to marry even without any ceremony at all. If that promise happened to be followed by intimacy canon law, in many cases treated the relationship as already binding, already something close to a marriage in progress, which meant a great many ordinary medieval couples were quietly living somewhere in the blurred space between courtship and marriage, long before any priest ever became involved. We know this partly because manor courts spent so much time managing it. On many English estates, an unfree woman could be fined for becoming pregnant outside of marriage, under a fee that even had its own particular medieval name, lerwhite. That kind of fine, appearing again and again in a lord's account books, tells its own quiet story. This was not some rare scandal whispered about once a generation and never repeated. It happened often enough that an entire legal category existed simply to manage it year after year, village after village, and historians still debate exactly how strictly or how selectively it was ever really enforced. None of this means medieval courtship was some free and easy anything-goes affair. It was not remotely. Reputation mattered enormously, especially for women, and a damaged reputation could close doors that never fully reopened again, ending a courtship before it even had the chance to become something permanent. A man who broke a promise usually walked away with little more than a bruised name. A woman in the same position could lose far more: her standing, her prospects, sometimes even her place within her own household, which is worth remembering before we romanticize any of this too far. But it does mean the picture so many of us inherited, prim, silent, entirely supervised from the cradle to the altar, simply does not line up with what the surviving records actually show. Remember Marjorie from a few minutes ago? She was about 20 years old when she and Richard first exchanged their private vows. To modern ears, that might sound like an unusually late, almost desperate match, a woman running out of better options. In fact, given everything we now know, Marjorie was not some tragic exception at all. She was, statistically speaking, well within the ordinary range for a woman of her era, quietly living out the very pattern historians would only piece together centuries later from stacks of dusty manor rolls, wage lists and court records nobody expected anyone to read again. So here is where I want to leave this particular thought with you. If a young woman spent close to a decade of her adult life working, earning her own wages, meeting people through her daily labour, being courted more or less in public, sometimes across more than one relationship, before anything permanent ever took shape, their medieval courtship starts to look far less like one single, arranged transaction handed down from above, and a great deal more like an actual lived, sometimes messy stage of a woman's life. Gossiped about, witnessed by half the parish, occasionally heartbroken, not nearly as different in shape from our own as we have been led to believe. Of course, everything I have just described belonged almost entirely to what historians would call ordinary women: servants, tradeswomen, farmers' daughters, women who worked for their own living and who largely chose or refused their own suitors within the loose boundaries their community allowed. That particular freedom thinned out considerably the higher a family climbed up the social ladder, because the moment a family owned land worth protecting, a name worth defending, or a fortune worth carefully combining with another family's fortune, courtship stopped being a slow public community affair and instead became something closer to a formal negotiation. conducted by fathers, lawyers, and occasionally kings, while the young woman at the centre of it all often sat several careful steps removed from her own future. Picture the difference for a moment. Instead of a well or a market stall or a shared bench by someone's fire, imagine a private room, two fathers, a stack of documents, and a daughter, who may not even be present for most of the conversation, deciding her own future. That is not an exaggeration. For families with land and titles at stake, it was often closer to how these things actually unfolded, and the surprising, occasionally infuriating details of exactly how those arrangements were made, and what a bride herself was or was not allowed to say about any of it, are about to get considerably more interesting. And that far more guarded world, the world of sealed contracts, calculated dowries, and marriages arranged well before a bride ever had any real say in the matter, is exactly where we are headed next. If Marjorie's story felt like a quiet act of rebellion a little while ago, that is only because of exactly how rigid the system around her truly was. To understand why one whispered promise could cause such an uproar, you have to understand what marriage was actually built to do at the very top of medieval society. And once you see it clearly, you may never look at a fairy tale wedding the same way again. Because here is where we leave the world of Wells market stalls and church steps behind and step into a much colder room. Let's start with a single word that rarely makes it into any romantic version of this story: wardship. If you've never heard that word before tonight, you would not be alone. It rarely survives into the popular version of medieval history, the version full of feasts and jousts and stolen glances across a crowded hall. But understanding it changes everything about how marriage actually worked among people with something worth inheriting. Picture a land-owning father, the kind with a manor tenants, maybe a title, who dies while his children are still young. In our world, the obvious next question is simple: who raises them? In medieval England, the question that actually got asked first was different and considerably less sentimental. Who profits from them? Because under feudal law, when a landholding father died, leaving an underage heir, that child, along with every acre they stood to inherit, became something called a ward, placed under the control of the family's feudal lord, sometimes the king himself. And wardship was not simply about deciding where a grieving child would sleep that night. It came bundled with two extraordinarily valuable rights: the right to manage and quietly profit from the child's entire inheritance until they came of age, and the right to arrange that child's eventual marriage. Both of those rights, and this is the part that tends to stop people, could be bought and sold like any other piece of property. Think about what that actually meant in practice. A lord who acquired a wardship could hold on to it and collect every penny of income the estate produced for years, while the child themselves received only whatever upkeep their guardian felt like providing. Or that same lord could turn around and sell the entire package to someone else, entirely a stranger, with no connection to the family at all, purely because that stranger happened to offer the highest price. The child had no vote in any of it. Neither in most cases did their own mother, who was frequently considered unsuitable to raise her own children, once their father died, on the reasoning that a mother's interests and the estate's interests might not perfectly align. A wealthy young heir or heiress was not simply cared for by whoever held their wardship. They were in the coldest possible sense an asset on someone else's ledger. A guardian could keep the wardship for himself, quietly marry his own son or daughter into that fortune, or simply sell the entire package, the child, the income, the future marriage, to whichever nobleman offered the highest price that season. Try to imagine being that child for a moment, old enough to understand what was happening, but far too young to have any say in it. One day a messenger arrives with news that your wardship has changed hands, that some new stranger, someone you have possibly never met, now controls your inheritance, your household, and eventually your husband or wife. You did not lose a parent and gain a guardian who loved you in their place. You lost a parent and became a line item transferred from one set of accounts to another. That is not an exaggeration for effect. It is quite literally how the paperwork read. Here is a question worth sitting with. If you had grown up knowing your own marriage had quite literally already been purchased by a stranger, before you were old enough to understand what that meant, how differently would you think about love? Would you even trust the word the way we use it now, or would it always carry just the faintest smell of a transaction underneath it? This practice was so widespread and apparently so open to abuse that it left a mark on one of the most famous documents in English history. When the Great Charter known as Magna Carta was sealed in the year 1215, buried among its clauses about justice and taxation is a line insisting that heirs must be married in its own phrasing without disparagement, meaning they could not simply be sold off to a husband or wife far beneath their own rank purely for someone else's profit. It was not a clause protecting love. It was a clause protecting property values dressed up in the language of dignity, which tells you almost everything you need to know about medieval marriage among the wealthy in a single sentence. Even so, think about what that tells you. A document remembered today mainly for reshaping the balance of power between kings and their subjects also had to specifically legislate against turning orphan children into a marriage bazaar. That clause did not appear out of nowhere. It appeared because the abuse behind it was common enough to demand it, and the abuse cut both ways. Widows too could become extremely lucrative property once their husbands died, since a widow often controlled land in her own right, sometimes considerable amounts of it. To a king or lord looking to reward a loyal follower, a wealthy widow was every bit as valuable a prize as an unmarried heiress, and every bit as likely to be handed off without much regard for what she herself wanted. Some fought back in the only way the system allowed them to. There is a documented case from the reign of King John in the early 13th century of a countess who simply paid the crown a fee, essentially buying her own freedom specifically so she would not be forced into a second marriage she never wanted. It tells you something remarkable, that in a system built almost entirely around controlling women's marriages for profit, a woman with enough money could occasionally buy her way out of the very same trap that was busy consuming women with less of it. That same king, incidentally, grew so fond of squeezing extra revenue out of these arrangements that he began charging fines even to male heirs simply for the privilege of getting married at all, a practice earlier custom had never really bothered with. Which, if nothing else, proves that when it came to medieval marriage and money, the system had a way of eventually finding new ways to profit off of everyone involved regardless of gender. Now let's bring this back to a family we already know rather well. Margaret Paston, the very same mother who marched her own daughter in front of a bishop to try to dissolve a marriage built on love, had not exactly arrived at her own marriage through romance either. When she married into the Paston family, she brought with her 9 manors inherited as the only child of a wealthy Norfolk family. That inheritance is very likely the single biggest reason the match happened at all. The Pastons needed exactly what Margaret's family could provide: land, income and legitimacy, for a family still climbing its way up from more humble beginnings. There is something quietly striking about that once you sit with it. The woman so furious that her daughter would choose a husband for love rather than advantage had herself once stood somewhere very similar, a young bride whose own worth had almost certainly been measured out loud in manners and income before anyone in the room particularly cared what she thought about the man she was marrying. It does not excuse what she later did to Marjorie. If anything, it makes it a little sadder and a little more human. She was not a villain guarding some ancient tradition of romance from a reckless daughter. She was in her own way defending the very same cold logic that had once been used to arrange her own life, the only version of marriage she'd ever been taught to trust. Have you ever noticed how often we do exactly that ourselves without meaning to? Defend the very rules that once limited us simply because we survived them, and somewhere along the way mistook survival for proof that the rules were right all along. So what did that cold logic actually look like on paper once a match had been agreed? Two words matter here, and people confuse them constantly: dowry and dower, which sound almost identical but mean nearly opposite things. A dowry was what a bride's family paid in land, coin or goods to secure the marriage in the first place, as essentially the price of entry into a particular family, and the negotiations over its exact size could stretch on for months, conducted by lawyers on both sides, the way we might now negotiate the sale of a house. A dower worked in reverse. It was the guarantee built into the marriage itself, promising the wife financial protection if her husband died before she did. Under English common law, that guarantee was remarkably specific. A widow was generally entitled to 1/3 of everything her husband had owned for the rest of her own life, regardless of what his will happened to say, and regardless of how her husband's family might feel about losing that much land to her. And here is a detail that tends to catch people off guard because it reshapes the entire mental image of a medieval wedding. That dower was not some quiet paperwork filed away after the fact. In many marriages, it was formally announced out loud in public at the actual church door before the couple ever stepped inside for the religious ceremony itself. Picture that scene for a moment. Guests gathered outside on the church steps in whatever weather the morning happened to offer, breath visible in the cold, listening as the groom publicly declared exactly which lands his bride would inherit if he died first, naming fields and manors, the way a modern couple might read out vows. Only once that financial promise had been spoken aloud, witnessed by the entire gathered crowd, would the couple finally walk through the doors and receive the church's blessing inside, where the actual sacrament, the part concerned with love and faith rather than land and money, would finally take place. The business of marriage came first outside in public. The sacrament came second inside in private. If that sounds almost more like signing a contract in front of witnesses than what we picture today when we imagine a wedding, that is because for families with property at stake it largely was. And it explains better than almost anything else why negotiations like the ones that once fell through again and again for Marjorie herself could collapse so easily over something as unromantic as money. When the financial terms are meant to be announced in front of the entire parish, there is very little room left to simply paper over a disagreement. This kind of arrangement was hardly unique to England either. Across the royal houses of Europe, marriages between children still too young to fully understand what they were agreeing to were routinely used to seal alliances between rival kingdoms, less a matter of romance than of chess. Each betrothal a move meant to secure a border, end a war, or forge a friendship that pure diplomacy alone could never quite guarantee. A treaty could always be broken. A marriage, at least in theory, was meant to bind two families together for generations. Nowhere is that clearer than at the very top of medieval society, where marriages were not simply family business, but occasionally actual affairs of state negotiated with the same seriousness as a border dispute or a trade agreement. In the year 1420, a treaty signed at Troyes formally arranged the marriage of King Henry V of England to Catherine of Valois, daughter of the French king, as part of a peace settlement meant to end decades of brutal war between the two countries. Their marriage was not really about the two of them at all. It was a clause in a political agreement negotiated for months by diplomats and lawyers, long before either of them likely exchanged more than a formal greeting. The terms covered far more than affection. whoever could succession rights to the French throne territories, titles the entire future shape of 2 kingdoms, all folded into a single marriage contract. Marriages at this level were sometimes even conducted, at least in their preliminary legally binding stages, by proxy, meaning a stand-in representative, usually a trusted nobleman or envoy, could formally accept vows on behalf of an absent bride or groom hundreds of miles away, sealing an alliance on paper before the 2 people involved had properly met in person at all. Somewhere a diplomat in unfamiliar robes stood before an altar, speaking words of marriage on behalf of a king, who was at that exact moment quite possibly still crossing the sea to collect his new wife in person. It is almost impossible not to compare that to a modern corporate merger, complete with lawyers, months of negotiation, and a formal signing ceremony, except the asset changing hands happened to be a person, somewhere between amusing and deeply unsettling depending on how long you let yourself sit with it. Try picturing a modern executive board meeting where the final item on the agenda is not a budget but a bride, the minutes carefully recording which territories come attached to which spouse. None of this is meant to suggest these marriages were always miserable. Plenty of arranged royal and noble matches against every modern assumption grew into genuine partnerships, sometimes even real affection, once 2 people had spent years actually building a life together. But that affection, when it came, arrived as a bonus the system never promised, never guaranteed, and frankly, never much cared about either way. Love, if it happened at all, was something the couple had to build entirely on their own after the contract was already signed and sealed. For younger children caught up in these grand arrangements, contracts were sometimes signed years before anyone involved could have meaningfully understood what they were agreeing to. It is worth being honest about that rather than glossing over it, because pretending medieval childhood was somehow untouched by all of this would be its own kind of dishonesty. Marriage at this level was rarely something that happened to a person all at once. It was something assembled slowly, piece by piece, contract by contract, often years before the wedding day itself, until the person at the centre of it all sometimes felt less like the author of their own future and more like the last signature required to finalise someone else's plan. But it is equally worth noting that the church itself, at least on paper, still insisted the couple had to give real spoken consent once they actually reached a marriageable age before any marriage could be considered valid in its own eyes, whatever a contract from years earlier might already claim. A signature from childhood on its own was never supposed to be enough, which sets up a strange contradiction sitting at the very heart of medieval marriage. Land money and family strategy shaped almost everything leading up to the wedding day, from the size of a dowry to the wording of a peace treaty. Yet the church's own law, the same law that once saved Marjorie from her own family's fury, still technically demanded that the final decision belonged to the 2 people standing at the altar and to nobody else in the room, however powerful they happened to be. How that contradiction actually played out in practice in real courtrooms, in real bishops' chambers, in ordinary households across the country, and just how far a determined woman could sometimes stretch, that single legal thread turns out to be one of the more surprising parts of this entire story. And that is exactly the thread we're about to follow next. That contradiction we just landed on, land and money pulling one direction, a bride and groom's own free will supposedly pulling the other, was not some minor legal footnote. It sat at the very centre of medieval marriage, and it deserves a proper look because the actual mechanics behind it are stranger and considerably more interesting than most of us were ever taught. In fact, once you understand how this particular piece of law actually worked, half the marriage stories from this entire era start to look completely different. So let's go back further than Marjorie, further than the Parstons entirely, all the way to the people who actually wrote the rule that eventually saved her. In the middle of the 12th century, a monk and legal scholar known to history simply as Gratian sat down and produced something like a master rule book for the entire church, pulling together centuries of scattered contradictory religious law into one coherent legal system. He worked out of Bologna in northern Italy, a city already becoming famous for exactly this kind of painstaking legal scholarship, and the book he eventually produced would go on to shape church law for the rest of the medieval period and well beyond it. Marriage was one of the trickiest tangles he had to sort through, and the position he helped establish, later sharpened and confirmed by a pope named Alexander III, ended up reshaping an institution that had until then meant wildly different things depending on which family, which region, and which century you happened to be born into. Before this period, marriage across medieval Europe was something of a patchwork, part church, custom, part local tradition, part whatever. A particular family had always done with no single unified rule about what actually made two people married in the first place. Some regions leaned heavily on public ceremony. Others cared more about family negotiation than any spoken vow at all. Gratian and the churchmen who built on his work spent decades untangling all of it, and what they eventually landed on was, in its own quiet way, almost radical. Strip away the property, strip away the family politics, strip away the priest, the witnesses, even the building itself, and ask what actually truly makes a marriage a marriage. Their answer came down to a single deceptively simple idea: two people freely choosing each other out loud. Here is the theological idea underneath all of it, and it is worth sitting with for a moment because it quietly flips something most of us assume without ever questioning it. We tend to think of a wedding as something a priest does to a couple. He says the words, he pronounces them married, he makes it official. Medieval church law saw it almost exactly backward. According to that law, the priest did not create the marriage at all. The couple did entirely on their own the moment they freely exchanged the right words with genuine intention. A priest's blessing was encouraged. It was expected. Respectable families certainly preferred it. But strictly speaking, under the church's own logic, it was decoration, not the engine underneath. Does that sound almost backward to you? It certainly surprised me the first time I properly understood it. We spend so much energy today debating who is allowed to officiate a wedding, and it turns out medieval theology quietly decided none of that mattered nearly as much as we assume. The officiant was optional, the consent was not. Now, within that framework, there were actually two distinct kinds of promises a couple could make to each other, and mixing them up could change someone's entire legal future. The first was called words of the present, spoken in the here and now, something along the lines of "I take you as my wife," right? This moment meant sincerely. Spoken correctly between two people, old enough to understand what they were saying, that alone created a full, unbreakable marriage, instantly, whether or not either family knew anything about it. The second was words of the future, a promise to marry someone later, closer to what we might now call an engagement. On its own, that kind of promise could technically still be broken. But if the couple who made it later slept together, canon law generally treated that as proof the future promise had quietly turned into a present one. The intimacy itself sealed it. Church lawyers spent an almost comical amount of ink arguing over the exact grammar required to tell these two kinds of promises apart. A sentence that sounded firm and immediate to one person might read to a trained church lawyer poring over it months later as something looser, softer, still technically escapable. Tense mattered. Timing mattered. Even a small shift in wording, the difference between "I marry you" and "I will marry you," could decide whether two people were bound together for the rest of their natural lives. Imagine trying to recall months or even years later, under formal questioning, the precise words you once murmured to someone you cared about. in a moment that felt private, unguarded, and entirely unremarkable at the time. Did you say "I will be yours" or "I am yours"? Did your tone make it a promise or a declaration already fulfilled? Most people then and now do not speak in careful legal tenses while falling for someone. They speak the way people in love have always spoken, loosely, warmly, without a single thought toward how a church official might later pass the grammar of it, which meant an enormous number of ordinary medieval relationships were floating somewhere inside a legal grey zone. Most people never consciously thought about at all. One clumsy sentence spoken in the wrong tense at the wrong moment, potentially changing two people's entire legal status, without either of them fully realizing what had just happened. Try imagining that for a second. A private conversation between two people who cared for each other, spoken quietly, half in jest, half seriously. The exact kind of thing said in 1,000 ordinary courtships across 1,000 ordinary years. Except in this particular century, depending on the precise wording and on what happened next, that conversation alone might already have married them with no priest, no family, and no formal ceremony required at all. The church itself grew uneasy about exactly this kind of quiet legal chaos. In the year 1215, the very same year England's nobility forced King John to seal Magna Carta, a great church council convened in Rome known as the Fourth Lateran Council, and among its many decisions was a serious attempt to rein in secret marriages once and for all. From that point forward, couples were formally required to have their intention to marry announced publicly in church on 3 separate occasions called bans, giving the wider community a chance to speak up if they knew any reason the marriage should not go ahead: an earlier relative, a hidden existing spouse, a promise already made to someone else entirely. Here is the part that makes the whole system feel almost designed to create confusion. The council disapproved of secret marriages. It truly tried to stamp them out. And yet, even after 1215, if two people did exchange real, sincere words of consent in private, with no bans, no priest, and no witnesses at all, the marriage the church had just spent enormous effort discouraging was still considered completely legally valid, illegal in procedure, unbreakable in substance. The church built an entire system meant to prevent exactly the kind of marriage Marjorie Paston would go on to make roughly 2.5 centuries later, and that same church's own rules were precisely what allowed her to win. It is worth pausing here to ask yourself something. If you knew that a handful of quietly spoken words could permanently bind you to someone with no ceremony required at all, would that make you more careful with your own words? Or would it make declarations of love feel a little more thrilling knowing they actually carried weight? Naturally, all of this ambiguity created an enormous amount of work for someone, and that someone turned out to be the church's own courts. Bishops across England found themselves running what amounted to a permanent ongoing docket of marriage disputes. Couples and families arguing over whether a particular conversation had truly counted, whether a promise made years earlier still held, whether one party had simply changed their mind and hoped nobody could prove otherwise. These were not rare dramatic exceptions. In some regions, marriage disputes made up a striking share of everything the church courts handled in a given year. Ordinary people arguing over the exact wording of a private conversation, sometimes with their entire future resting on which version the court believed. A weaver, a widow, a farmer's second son, all of them capable of ending up in front of the same official who might the very next week be settling a property dispute between two earls. In the eyes of this particular court, at least everyone's private words carried the exact same legal weight. Because that uncertainty cut both directions, and this is the part of the story that tends to get left out entirely. Yes, this legal framework occasionally let couples like Marjorie and Richard claim a love match no family could undo. but the very same doctrine of consent also offered a way out for people trapped on the opposite end of the same problem, individuals who had been pressured, frightened, or outright forced into speaking marriage vows they never actually wanted to say. Because remember, canon law did not simply require that the words be spoken, it required that they be spoken freely. Consent obtained through genuine fear or coercion was not real consent at all, at least according to the Church's own theology, which meant a marriage built on force could in principle be challenged and undone. Try imagining the position this created for someone, most likely a young woman, standing in a hall with her family gathered around her, being told in 100 small and large ways exactly what would happen if she refused to speak the words expected of her that day. Perhaps it was never a raised hand, never an outright threat, simply a father's cold disappointment, a mother's tears, the quiet understanding that saying no would mean losing her family entirely. She speaks the words. From the outside, the marriage looks completely ordinary, a contract signed, a ceremony held, guests fed, and sent home satisfied. And yet, according to the Church's own deepest logic, if her heart had never actually agreed to any of it, nothing legally binding had happened at all. The words had been spoken, the consent had not. Historians studying appeals sent to Rome in the final decades of the 15th century have found something quietly remarkable. Buried in those old petitions, requests some from women describing exactly this situation. A marriage entered into only because a father, a guardian, or sometimes even physical threats had left them feeling they had no real choice at all. They are asking the Church's own highest authority to recognize what they already knew in their own hearts, that whatever words they had technically spoken, they had never truly consented to any of it. Picture what it must have taken to send a petition like that in an age with no telephone, no postal service as we would understand it often. No ability to even write the appeal yourself if you had never been taught your letters. Someone in that position needed a scribe willing to put dangerous words on parchment, a messenger willing to carry them across hundreds of miles of unreliable road, and enough patience to wait months, sometimes longer, for any kind of answer at all, with no guarantee the answer would even favour them. That a meaningful number of these petitions survive at all tells you two things at once. That real coercion inside real medieval marriages was common enough to produce a steady paper trail, and that at least some of the people trapped inside those marriages refused to simply accept it as the price of being born a woman, or born poor, or born beneath someone else's authority. It is worth remembering too that not every one of these petitions succeeded. Plenty were denied or quietly dismissed or simply outlasted the person brave enough to send them in the first place. This was never a perfect system dispensing justice evenly to everyone who deserved it. It was a slow, expensive, occasionally indifferent bureaucracy run by men who did not always believe the women standing in front of them. But its very existence, the fact that this door was even theoretically open, meant something. It meant the Church's own theology, however imperfectly it was applied in practice, refused to treat a forced yes as the same thing as a real one. I want to be honest with you about how this actually played out in practice, rather than making it sound like some tidy medieval safety net. Proving coercion was difficult, often painfully so. It meant standing before church officials and essentially arguing against your own recorded words, against a ceremony that may have looked from the outside entirely normal, sometimes against the very same family members who had pressured you into it in the first place. Courts could be skeptical. Families with money and influence generally had an easier time being believed than those without. This was not a guaranteed escape hatch waiting patiently for anyone who needed it. It was a narrow, difficult, sometimes heartbreaking legal fight. But it existed. That is the important part. In a world so thoroughly organized around fathers' dowries and family strategy, medieval church law still carved out one small stubborn space where an individual's own free will was supposed to outweigh everyone else's plans for them in both directions. It could trap two people together against their family's wishes. It could also, at least in theory, set one person free from a marriage their family had forced upon them. The same legal principle pointed at two completely different problems. Do you find it strange that a system built almost entirely on hierarchy and control still had to make room for something as personal as unmeasurable as a person's own sincere intention? I find it strange and a little reassuring both at once. Even the people writing these rules seem to have understood on some level that a marriage built on a lie could never really hold, the way one built on honesty could, whatever the family finances happen to say about it. There is a version of this story where the church comes across as nothing but an obstacle, another institution designed to control women's lives from cradle to grave, and plenty of its history certainly earns that reputation. But sitting right at the centre of its own marriage law is this stubborn, almost inconvenient insistence on the individual conscience, a principle that occasionally worked directly against the interests of the very families, the very fortunes, and even the very kings the church so often found itself allied with. Consistency was never medieval law's strongest quality. Neither, frankly, is most modern law, but that one persistent thread, freely given consent, kept surfacing again and again, whether it was convenient for the powerful or not. That is not the version of medieval marriage law most of us grew up hearing about, and it deserves a little more credit than it usually gets. Flaws, inconsistencies and all. Of course, all of this legal architecture, present consent, future consent, bans, coercion, church councils in Rome, applied just as much to a farmer's daughter as it did to a duke's, and that raises an interesting question worth carrying with us as we leave the courtrooms and church councils behind for a while. If the law itself made so little distinction between a peasant woman and a noblewoman when it came to something as fundamental as consent, what did courtship actually look like for the women who never appear in any legal record at all? The ones simply living their lives out in the fields, the markets and the village greens of medieval England. That is exactly where we're headed next. A farmer's daughter never once set foot inside a bishop's chamber. She never needed a treaty, a proxy, or a lawyer to negotiate her future, and yet in her own quiet corner of medieval England she was navigating a courtship culture every bit as rich as ritualized, and honestly as much fun as anything we have talked about so far tonight, even if none of it ever earned itself a line in a royal chronicle. It is easy, after all this talk of church courts and marriage contracts, to start picturing medieval life as one long, grinding legal negotiation. So let's step outside for a while, out of the stone chambers and the lawyers' offices, into open air, into noise, music, and the smell of fresh ale, because that is honestly where most medieval courtship actually happened, for the overwhelming majority of medieval people who would never in their lives see the inside of a manor house, let alone a royal court. Here is a word that almost never survives into the modern telling of this story. Specifically something called a church ale, which, despite the name, had very little to do with quiet religious devotion, and a great deal to do with an entire parish getting together to brew enormous quantities of beer, sell it for a good cause, and throw one of the biggest parties of the year. Parishes across medieval England used these gatherings to raise money, sometimes for the upkeep of the church roof, sometimes for the poor, and the formula rarely changed much from village to village. 2 church wardens would be put in charge of the whole affair, collecting contributions of malt, honey and coin from anyone who could spare it, brewing it all together, and then selling cups of the finished ale to absolutely everyone who showed up, parishioner and passing traveller alike. Think about how strange that would look to a modern visitor stepping straight off the street. A church of all institutions organising what amounted to a village-wide beer festival on its own grounds, with its own blessing as an entirely normal and respectable way to raise funds. We tend to imagine medieval religious life as endlessly solemn, all incense and quiet prayer. A great deal of it absolutely was, but plenty of it also looked like this loud communal, and more than a little rowdy, sanctioned by the very same church that spent its Sunday mornings preaching restraint. It is not so different, if you think about it, from a modern parish holding a summer fundraiser with a beer tent and a raffle, except nobody today seems quite as comfortable admitting the two traditions might share the same ancestry. And show up they did. A proper church ale meant wrestling matches on the village green archery contest, dancing that could stretch on for the better part of a day, musicians with fifes, bagpipes and drums keeping the whole thing moving. It was in the truest sense the medieval version of a town festival, and unmarried young people from miles around treated it exactly the way you would expect. Here is a small detail worth sitting with because it quietly reshapes something we say constantly without ever thinking about where it came from. The very word bridal, as in a bridal shower or a bridal gown, comes directly from an older term, bride ale, the specific celebration thrown to help fund a couple's wedding. Somewhere in the deep roots of that cheerful modern word sits a village literally selling cups of homemade beer to help a young couple afford to get married. Language holds on to history in the strangest places. Every time a modern bride walks into a shop today looking for a bridal registry, she's without knowing it echoing a village fundraiser 8 centuries old. Now, if a church ale was the parish fundraiser version of this culture, plenty of other named celebrations followed the very same pattern throughout the year. A lamb ale around shearing season marking the point when the flocks finally gave up their wool, and a little extra coin briefly found its way into the village. A Whitsun ale tied to the church calendar in early summer, one of the largest gatherings of the entire year, when the weather finally cooperated long enough for an outdoor celebration to run from morning well into evening. Smaller informal gatherings simply called a bid ale, where the whole community was invited and expected to chip in something to help a struggling neighbour rebuild a barn or recover from a bad season. Nearly every one of them came stitched together with music, dancing and games, which meant nearly every one of them doubled, whether the church intended it or not, as an unofficial meeting ground for the unmarried. It is worth noticing too how differently these gatherings treated men and women's roles from what we sometimes assume. Women were not simply spectators at the edge of the crowd watching men perform for their attention. They danced. They competed in their own games. They organised and sold the ale itself in many parishes, collecting the coin, keeping the accounts running, what was in effect a small seasonal business for the benefit of the whole community. Churchwardens' accounts from this period occasionally list women by name managing exactly this kind of event, a detail easy to skim past and remarkable once you actually stop on it. A young woman running a church ale stall was not hiding quietly indoors waiting for a suitor to arrive. She was standing in the middle of the village's biggest social event of the season, visible, capable, and entirely in charge of her own small corner of it. Think about what that actually solved. A small village might only have a handful of unmarried people anywhere close to the right age, which made finding someone outside your own close relatives quite difficult, and marrying too close to your own kin carried its own thorny problems under church law. Fairs and ales pulled people in from neighbouring villages, sometimes from several parishes, over widening the pool of possible partners in a way that ordinary daily village life simply could not manage on its own. In a world with no other way to meet someone from 3 villages away, these gatherings were doing quiet, essential demographic work, even if nobody at the time would have described it in those terms. Picture the scene properly for a moment, because if you are turning any of this into images later, this is worth lingering on. A village green in early summer, trampled grass, the smell of yeast and wood smoke drifting from the brewing kettles, a fiddle or a set of pipes, cutting through the noise of a crowd that has clearly been drinking since midday. A ribbon-wrapped pole standing at the centre of it, all garlands of hawthorn and early flowers looped between doorways. Young men competing openly at wrestling or archery, showing off in front of an audience that absolutely includes every unmarried woman for miles, whether they admit it or not. Couples slipping toward the edges of the crowd to talk without quite so many eyes on them. Though, as we already know from earlier tonight, nobody in a medieval village ever truly escaped being watched. Many of these springtime gatherings, particularly the ones tied to May, layered an extra bit of theatre on top of the usual dancing and drinking. Villages sometimes elected their own summer king and queen for the day, a young unmarried man and woman crowned, however briefly, to lead the games and preside over the festivities, often alongside performances built loosely around outlaw legends already circulating through the countryside. Being chosen for a role like that was not a small thing. It meant standing at the centre of your entire community's attention for an afternoon in the company of whichever young man or woman had been chosen alongside you, in front of every single person who might one day matter to your future. Whole friendships could be quietly reorganized around who ended up crowned beside whom. That particular year and village memory, unlike a modern calendar, had a habit of holding on to that kind of detail for a very long time afterward. Here is a question worth asking yourself. Does that sound like the grim, joyless medieval world so many movies love to show us? Or does it sound honestly a little more like a modern summer festival, minus the phones and the sunscreen? And here is a second question, maybe a slightly harder one. How many of your own family's stories are grandmother and grandfather who met at a dance, a summer fair, a wedding? They were only distantly invited to actually trace back to some version of exactly this. We tend to think of dating apps and city nightlife as the great invention that finally solved the problem of meeting people. Really, they are just the latest attempt at something villages were already doing perfectly well 800 years ago, with considerably better music arguably, and a great deal less screen time. There was, however, one important complication running underneath all of this cheerful noise, at least for a large portion of the peasantry, and it is worth being honest about it rather than pretending village courtship existed entirely outside the reach of lords and landlords. Many peasant families, particularly those living as unfree tenants, technically owed their lords something called merchita fee, paid specifically for permission to marry off a daughter. In principle, this meant a father could not simply agree to his daughter's marriage without the lord's approval, or without handing over a payment for the privilege recorded neatly in the same manor court rolls that tracked rents, fines, and every other small transaction of village life. In practice, historians who have combed through surviving manor records find enormous variation, from estate to estate, some lords charging steep fees, treating it as a real revenue stream to be squeezed. For all it was worth, others collecting little more than a token payment. More custom than genuine obstacle, barely worth the ink used to record it. Try to imagine sitting across from your own father while he calculates whether the family can even afford the fee required for you to marry the person you actually want. Not whether the match itself makes sense, not whether the two of you suit each other. Simply whether there is enough spare coin after a hard season to pay a lord who had absolutely nothing to do with the relationship itself, purely for the privilege of it being allowed to continue. Love in this particular corner of medieval life occasionally came with a very literal price tag, attached, set by someone who had never even met the couple in question. There is something almost absurd about it once you picture the mechanics clearly. Somewhere in a cold manor office, a steward dips his pen and calmly records a small fee against a farmer's name, the exact same ledger page where he might note a fine for a stray pig or an unpaid rent, and tucked into that same page in the same flat. Administrative handwriting sits the financial permission slip for someone's entire future family. History rarely announces its more heartbreaking moments with any particular drama. Most of the time it simply writes them down in the margins between the pigs and the rent. So even here in the world of wrestling matches and homemade ale away from bishops and marriage treaties, a shadow of feudal control still reached into the most personal decision a family could make. Freedom in medieval England rarely came without at least some string attached to somebody's ledger, and yet that fee, however real, rarely seems to have stopped courtship itself from happening exactly the way we have just described, openly, publicly chosen, largely by the young people involved rather than negotiated purely by their elders. The lord might collect his fee eventually. He was almost never the one doing the actual choosing. There is a particular myth worth dismantling directly here because it tends to pair itself naturally with the locked-away maiden idea we already took apart earlier tonight. The assumption that peasant marriage, being poor, being practical, being about survival above everything else, must therefore have had no real room left over for affection. Surviving ballads and popular songs from the period tell a rather different story, describing young men wooing sweethearts with small gifts of food, coin, and clothing, courting them across market days and festival afternoons in language that sounds honestly remarkably familiar. Poverty shaped these relationships in enormous ways. It did not erase the wanting. If you think about it, that actually makes a certain kind of sense. The wealthier classes rarely had the luxury of enjoying. A noble marriage negotiation involved land titles and alliances, stakes far too high to simply hand over to two young people's private feelings, as we spent a good while establishing not long ago. A peasant couple, more often than not, had considerably less property riding on the outcome. Sometimes, ironically, having less to lose gave you a little more room to actually choose. There is something almost gently funny about that particular irony once you sit with it. The families with the most freedom to marry for love were quite often the families with the least money to protect by not doing so, while the families with castles and titles to guard ended up with the least freedom of anyone in the entire kingdom. None of which is to romanticize peasant life into something it never was. It was hard, physical, uncertain work year after year, and courtship had to fit itself around harvest schedules, plague years, bad weather, and the constant threat of a poor season turning into genuine hunger. A wedding celebrated too extravagantly during a difficult year could easily draw resentment from neighbours who had little to spare themselves, which is likely part of why the community-funded bride ale system existed in the first place, spreading the cost of a wedding across many small contributions, rather than asking one struggling family to shoulder it alone. There was, in other words, a real practical communal wisdom hiding underneath what might otherwise look like nothing more than an excuse to drink. Everyone contributed a little, so that no single family carried the whole burden of beginning a new life together alone. But within all of that hardship, medieval peasants still found time again and again, documented in court testimony, in surviving ballads, in the sheer persistence of festivals built specifically around courtship and marriage, to flirt, to dance, to show off a little in front of someone they liked, and occasionally to fall in love on their own terms. Which brings us quite naturally to something we've only brushed past so far tonight almost in passing. All that talk of small gifts of coin and food and clothing, changing hands during a courtship market stalls, wooden combs, ribbons, the occasional handful of apples pressed into someone's palm with a little too much meaning attached. Because it turns out medieval people across every single class we've discussed tonight, from a bailiff's daughter to a farmer's son, to a princess promised away by treaty, took the business of gift-giving a great deal more seriously than a passing mention deserves. What looked on the surface like small, sweet, almost throwaway gestures turns out to have operated by its own careful set of rules. Rules that shaped who could court whom, how seriously a relationship was meant to be taken, and occasionally exactly how much a person's affection was expected to cost. And that, as it happens, is exactly where we are headed next. Let's talk about something historians only really started taking seriously in the last couple of years, something that quietly reshapes almost everything we think we understand about medieval romance. The gifts, not the grand gestures, not rings exchanged at a church door or manners signed over in a marriage contract. The small stuff. A pair of gloves, a silver pin, a handful of early apples pressed into someone's palm at a market stall. The kind of detail that seems too minor to matter right up until you realize medieval people themselves clearly did not think it was minor at all. In fact, the closer historians look at exactly this kind of small, ordinary object, the more it starts to look like the real engine driving medieval courtship, far more than any of the grand legal machinery we have spent the last several parts of tonight untangling. It is a strange thought, honestly, that the deepest truths about how two people actually fell for each other in this period might be hiding not in a bishop's court, but in a market receipt for a pair of gloves nobody thought was worth remembering. Here is the idea that recent research has put forward, and it is honestly a little startling once you sit with it properly. Courtship in medieval England was not simply a path toward marriage, a kind of waiting room two people sat in until the wedding finally happened. It was often its own separate thing, entirely a pastime, an amusement, sometimes even a small source of income that could exist perfectly well on its own, whether or not it ever led anywhere near an altar. And running underneath that entire pastime was an assumption almost nobody bothered to hide or apologize for. If a man wanted the pleasure of a woman's company, her conversation, her attention, possibly more, he was expected to pay for it in a very literal material sense. I want to be careful with how I say that because it is easy to make it sound colder than it actually felt to the people living it. This was not treated as scandalous or transactional in some seedy modern sense. It was simply understood openly by everyone involved the way we might now understand that a first date generally involves someone picking up a bill. Except in medieval England, this expectation stretched across the entire courtship, not just one evening, and it applied whether or not marriage was ever seriously on the table. A man who courted a woman for months without ever bringing so much as a ribbon would not have looked romantic or modest by the standards of his own time. He would have looked cheap, and word of that tended to travel. Think about what that actually looked like day to day. A young man interested in a particular young woman did not simply show up and start a conversation. He arrived with something. Gloves dyed and stitched expensive enough to matter, since good gloves in this period were not the cheap disposable item we think of them as now, but a small genuine luxury. A length of ribbon brightly dyed, imported from further away than the buyer could usually afford to travel himself. A small silver ring not necessarily meant as any kind of formal engagement, simply a pretty valuable little object. Sometimes food fruit out of season, a joint of meat, sweetened wine, anything that signalled he had spent real coin purely for her benefit. None of it needed to lead anywhere. That was in its own way the entire point. The gift itself was the message, not a down payment toward some larger future transaction. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If gift-giving in courtship never actually promised marriage at all, only attention and effort, how differently would we think about romantic gestures today? Would flowers on a first date feel more honest once you stopped assuming they were secretly an audition for something permanent? Now, this arrangement mattered enormously for one particular group of women we've already spent some time with tonight. The single women living independently, earning their own modest wages, often with no family fortune standing behind them at all. For a woman like that, the small material world of courtship was not simply flattering. It could be truly useful. A pair of good gloves saved her the cost of buying her own. A shared meal was one meal she did not have to stretch her own wages to cover. A length of good cloth quietly given might be the difference between mending an old dress yet again, and finally having something new to wear to the next church ale. Historians studying this period have started pushing back hard against an older, harsher way of describing women who accepted these gifts, language that once painted them as greedy or calculating forever, angling for whatever a man could be persuaded to hand over. Looked at honestly through the lens of what survival actually required for a woman with very little behind her, it looks a great deal more like need than greed. A woman navigating the world with no land, no dowry, and no guaranteed safety net was simply being practical about where a little extra help might come from, and there is nothing especially shameful in that, whatever later harsher centuries decided to say about it. That reframing matters, and I think it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. It would be easy looking back from where we stand now to judge these women by a set of assumptions built for people who already have options. Most of these women did not have many, and accepting a pair of gloves from an attentive suitor was for plenty of them simply good sense dressed up as romance, or perhaps romance dressed up as good sense. It is difficult, honestly, to say where one ended and the other began, and I am not sure medieval women themselves always drew a hard line between the two either. Here is where the legal system managed to find its way into even this, because of course it did, and this part connects to something we touched on earlier tonight from an entirely different angle. Just as words spoken in the wrong tense could accidentally create a legally binding marriage, neither party fully intended objects too could carry meaning far heavier than the person giving them ever planned. When couples ended up disputing whether a real marriage promise had been made, church courts sometimes had to weigh in on exactly this question. Was a particular ring simply a pretty gift freely given with no strings attached, or was it what the record sometimes called an earnest? A kind of down payment on a future marriage meant to be understood as a serious pledge the moment it was accepted. The same small silver ring could mean two entirely different things, depending on what everyone involved actually intended by it, and proving which one it had been, months or years after the fact was rarely simple. Picture being called before a church official laying a small ring on the table in front of you, and being asked with complete seriousness to explain exactly what you believed that ring meant the day it was given. Your entire legal future in some cases hinging on your ability to accurately reconstruct the emotional weight of a single object from memory months or years after the moment itself had blurred into 100 other small memories. It is almost funny in the same bittersweet way so much of this story keeps turning out to be. And it is also, if you think about it, not so far removed from a modern argument over what exactly a particular gift, a certain kind of message, a specific gesture was actually supposed to mean between two people who now remember that moment completely differently. There was rarely a clean universal rule the courts could simply apply. Local custom mattered. The value of the object mattered. A cheap ribbon read very differently from a ring that had clearly cost someone a meaningful sum. The manner in which it was given mattered too, whether it was pressed quietly into a hand in private or handed over in front of a laughing crowd at a village ale, where half the parish could later be called to testify about the look on both their faces when it happened. A gift given quietly away from witnesses tended to be far harder to prove either way, which meant a couple truly trying to signal serious intent often had good reason to make sure at least a few people were watching when they did it. The opposite of what we might now assume romance is supposed to look like. None of this should suggest every courting relationship in medieval England was quietly angling toward marriage, either however serious the gift-giving might have looked from the outside. Plenty of these relationships were understood by everyone involved as exactly what they appeared to be: pleasant, ongoing, openly acknowledged companionship with no particular promise attached to it at all. A woman could accept a man's gifts, enjoy his company at a market stall or a village festival, and never intend to marry him specifically. The same way modern people can date casually, without every single evening secretly functioning as a marriage interview. Medieval courtship, it turns out, had far more room for this kind of open-ended, unresolved relationship than the tidy fairy tale version usually allows for. That distinction between courtship as a destination and courtship as its own reward feels almost radical against everything popular imagination tells us about this period. We tend to assume every medieval romance was either heading toward a church door or heading nowhere at all. Tragedy or triumph, nothing in between. The reality buried in these small, unglamorous exchanges of gloves and ribbon and shared meals looks considerably more like ordinary human life, actually tends to look messy, undefined, occasionally going nowhere in particular, and no less real for it. It also quietly complicates something we spent real time establishing earlier tonight: the idea that a single object or a single sentence could accidentally trap two people into marriage without either one fully intending it. If courtship itself carried no automatic promise, if gifts could simply be gifts and nothing more, then the danger of accidental marriage was never quite as constant as it might have sounded a few parts ago. People navigated this uncertainty every single day, mostly successfully, occasionally disastrously, the same imperfect way people have always navigated the blurry, undefined space between meeting someone and truly committing to them. It would also be unfair to paint this entire arrangement as purely one-sided men spending, women simply receiving. Women contributed their own share to these relationships, sometimes in kind, sometimes in effort, care, labor, or simple companionship freely offered in return, and occasionally women gave gifts of their own as well-embroidered items, small tokens made by their own hand, rather than purchased a shirt stitched with careful, visible effort meant to say something. Words might have struggled to express as clearly. The exchange ran in more than one direction, even if the historical record, shaped disproportionately by men's accounts and men's expenses, tends to make the male side of the ledger considerably easier to trace centuries later. A man's spending left a paper trail, an accounting entry, a debt to be repaid. A woman's hours spent sewing by firelight rarely left any trace at all, which tells you something about whose labor history bothered to write down and whose it's simply expected. Here is a question worth turning over for a moment. If a gift you made yourself with hours of your own time meant more back then than something simply purchased, what does that suggest about how we have quietly reversed that value today, where a handmade gift can sometimes feel like the cheaper option rather than the more meaningful one? Consider, too, how much daily calculation must have gone into all of this on both sides, a kind of ongoing unspoken bookkeeping. Neither party ever wrote down, but almost certainly kept track of anyway. A young man weighing how much of his modest wages he could reasonably spend on a woman who had so far given him no particular promise in return. A young woman weighing whether a particular suitor's attention and his gifts were worth the risk to her own reputation if the relationship went nowhere, or worse, went somewhere she never intended. Neither side operated with anything like certainty. Courtship then as now was mostly a long exercise in reading signals nobody had fully agreed on the meaning of in advance. I find something quietly moving in that uncertainty, honestly. We tend to picture the past as somehow more settled than our own confusing romantic lives, as though people back then simply knew the rules and followed them without a second thought. The truth, once you actually dig into it, looks far more familiar than that. Two people each privately wondering what the other one meant by a gift, a comment, a lingering glance across a market stall, neither one entirely sure how much to read into it, both hoping they were reading it correctly. That particular kind of nervous uncertainty, it turns out, was never a modern invention. It has simply been wearing different clothes for the better part of 1,000 years. There is something almost funny and honestly a little comforting about realizing how old this particular argument actually is. Somewhere in medieval England, a young man was almost certainly grumbling to a friend about how much a season of courting a particular woman was costing him in gloves and ribbons and small silver trinkets, while she quietly weighed whether his attention was worth accepting in the first place. Meanwhile, somewhere else entirely, an older relative was probably warning a young woman not to accept gifts too easily, lest people start talking the exact same warning. Countless mothers have offered countless daughters in every century, since usually to roughly the same amount of effect. The specific question of who pays for what in the early uncertain stages of getting to know someone did not begin with the modern debate over splitting a dinner bill. It has apparently been running in one form or another for the better part of 1,000 years. And it does not look like either side has fully settled it yet. So if that was the practical material side of medieval courtship, coins, gloves, careful legal arguments over the meaning of a ring, there was also running at exactly the same time in exactly the same century, a completely different vision of love being written down, one that had almost nothing to do with gloves or coins at all. One that insisted love was not a transaction, not a negotiation, but something closer to a sacred, agonizing, almost impossible ideal, performed mostly by knights in poems for women they were absolutely never supposed to actually have. And that particular fantasy is exactly where we're headed next. Somewhere around the middle of the 12th century in the sun-warmed courts of southern France, a group of poets began writing about love in a way almost nobody had written about it before. Not love as a household arrangement. Not love as gloves and ribbons exchanged at a market stall. Something closer to worship, elevated, agonizing, deliberately, almost proudly impossible. And here is the detail that tends to catch people completely off guard the moment they actually understand it properly. This entire tradition, the one so many of us picture whenever someone says medieval romance nights, ladies' devoted service secret longing, was by design almost never about marriage at all. Let that sit for a second, because it quietly undoes a great deal of what popular culture has handed us about this period. Every fairy tale, rescue, every anguished ballad, every image of a knight kneeling before his lady borrows its emotional grammar from a literary movement that had in its purest form almost nothing to do with the practical, negotiated, gift-exchanging, church-supervised world of actual medieval marriage we have spent this entire video carefully mapping out. The poets we now call troubadours worked out of the region once known as Occitania, in what is today southern France, composing verse in their own regional tongue about a particular kind of love later given the somewhat clinical academic label courtly love. In their poems, a knight or a nobleman falls into devoted, often desperate admiration for a lady, frequently a married noblewoman, someone he could never legitimately have, and rather than treating that as tragic or improper, the entire poetic tradition treated it as the noblest, most refining experience a person could go through. Suffering for love, according to this tradition, made a man better. Wanting something you were never supposed to have was not a flaw in the system. It was the entire point of the system. Imagine trying to explain that particular logic to someone living an ordinary life in a farming village. Someone we spent real time with only a little while ago tonight, courting openly at a church ale, weighing whether a pair of gloves was worth accepting from a hopeful suitor. To that person, love that could never lead anywhere, admiration deliberately kept at arm's length forever, would likely have sounded less like poetry and more like an elaborate form of self-inflicted misery. Two entirely different medieval worlds sharing a language, a religion, and a century, yet holding almost opposite ideas about what love was even supposed to accomplish. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If the most celebrated romantic ideal of an entire era was explicitly built around loving someone you could not marry, what does that tell you about how differently medieval culture separated the idea of love from the practical business of marriage? We have spent this whole video taking apart piece by piece this poetic fashion spread north out of Occitania and eventually reached some of the most powerful courts in Europe, carried along in no small part by one particular woman whose own family history reads like something out of the poems themselves. Eleanor of Aquitaine's own grandfather is generally counted among the earliest troubadour poets on record, which meant Eleanor herself grew up steeped in exactly this literary world long before she went on to become queen first of France and later of England. Her daughter, Marie Countess of Champagne, inherited both the family taste for this kind of poetry and apparently a genuine curiosity about turning its loose romantic ideals into something more like an actual set of rules. Picture that particular household for a moment, generation after generation of women who had grown up surrounded by verse about impossible aching devotion, women who themselves had lived through very real, very political, very calculated marriages of their own, arranged for territory and alliance the way we spent an earlier part of tonight untangling in detail. There is something almost poignant about that combination. Women who understood better than almost anyone alive exactly how transactional real marriage could be, apparently developing a particular fondness for poetry about the one kind of love that was never expected to become transactional at all. Which brings us to one of the strangest, most quietly entertaining documents to survive from this entire era. Somewhere around 1185, a chaplain known to history as Andreas Capellanus, almost certainly working within Marie's own court, sat down and produced a treatise commonly known today simply as About Love, sometimes translated more loosely as a guide to courtly love itself. He wrote it by his own account as instruction for a younger man, walking him through the pitfalls, the etiquette, and eventually a formal numbered list of rules governing how proper noble love was supposed to behave. The whole thing reads at times less like a poem and more like a legal code, methodical, almost bureaucratic in places, as though someone had taken the giddy emotional chaos of falling for another person and quietly filed it into neat numbered clauses. The same instinct that gave us marriage contracts and dower agreements now pointed at something considerably less practical. Some of those rules truly startled contemporary readers, and honestly, they still land as a little startling now. One of the most frequently repeated lines from the entire work states more or less directly that marriage itself is no valid excuse for refusing to love someone else. Sit with that phrasing for a second, because it is doing something rather bold. It is not simply tolerating love outside marriage as an unfortunate occasional human failing. It is treating marriage and love as two almost entirely separate categories, operating under two completely different sets of rules, with barely any expected overlap between them. Other rules in the same list insist that love cannot exist between people already married to each other at all, that jealousy actually increases the value of love rather than damaging it, and that a person can only truly love one partner at a time, however many admirers might otherwise compete for their attention. Coming from a chaplain, a man whose entire professional life was built around church teaching, that is a fairly remarkable position to put into writing, and it did not go unnoticed by his contemporaries either. Even at the time, readers seem to have understood there was something knowingly provocative about a man of the church producing what amounted to an etiquette manual for extramarital devotion, dressed up in the respectable language of moral philosophy. And here is where the story takes a turn that tends to delight people once they hear it. After pages upon pages meticulously praising love, codifying its rules, walking through the entire elaborate etiquette of noble devotion, the very same treatise abruptly flips course near its end and condemns love almost entirely, warning that it leads only to ruin and urging the reader to avoid it altogether. The very man who spent the bulk of his book building an elaborate cathedral to romantic longing spends its final pages quietly setting fire to the whole structure. Scholars have argued about that contradiction for a very long time, and honestly nobody has fully settled it. Some read it as sincere religious guilt creeping back in at the last moment, a chaplain remembering his actual job, perhaps, even under some quiet pressure to soften what he had written before it reached the wrong set of eyes. Others read the entire treatise as satire from the very first page, an elaborate, straight-faced joke about courtly romance that modern readers missing centuries of shared cultural context simply take far too literally the medieval equivalent of a wickedly deadpan piece of writing whose humour has not aged in a way we can easily recognise anymore. I find myself landing somewhere in between the two readings, honestly. It feels entirely possible for a clever literate man in a sophisticated court to have meant both things, at once delighting in the fantasy, while quietly poking fun at how seriously everyone around him seemed to take it, the same way a modern writer might satirize a trend while still clearly enjoying every minute spent inside it. There is another detail from this same world worth pausing on, mostly because historians still argue over whether it ever actually happened. Andreas describes something called courts of love gatherings, where noblewomen, Marie among them, supposedly sat in formal judgment over real romantic disputes, brought before them debating fine points of etiquette and handing down official rulings the way a judge might settle a property claim. A man might ask in all apparent seriousness whether love could survive once a couple actually married. A noblewoman might rule on the question with the same gravity a real judge would bring to a property dispute, and the answer, more often than not, according to Marie's own recorded opinion within the text, leaned toward no insisting that true courtly love and marriage simply could not coexist in the same relationship. Did noblewomen truly convene these sessions robed and seated, handing down verdicts on matters of the heart the way a bishop might rule on a contested marriage vow? Did they exist purely on the page, an elegant literary fiction dressed up as documented fact, a kind of sophisticated parlour game played out for the entertainment of a court with considerable time on its hands? The honest answer is that we simply do not know for certain, and serious historians remain split on it even now. Whether real or imagined, though, the fact that anyone found the idea worth writing down at all tells you something about how seriously this particular fantasy was being taken in at least some corners of aristocratic life. Because make no mistake, this entire tradition belonged overwhelmingly to the aristocracy and mostly to its most leisured literate corners at that. A farmer's daughter trading gloves and apples at a village ale, the kind of courtship we spent real time with only a little while ago tonight, had essentially nothing in common with a knight composing anguished verse about a lady he was never permitted to touch. These were not two versions of the same medieval love story. They were, in a very real sense, two entirely different medieval love stories, running on completely separate tracks, occasionally read by the same aristocratic audience, but rarely if ever practiced by the same people. It is worth asking why a tradition so disconnected from ordinary life managed to become so influential in the first place, remembered centuries later while entire generations of real, ordinary medieval marriages simply vanished from the record. Part of the answer is almost embarrassingly simple. Poetry survives. Parchment carefully copied and recopied by scribes who valued beautiful language tends to outlast the daily unremarkable business of most people's actual lives. We remember what got written down artfully, not necessarily what was most common. An entire category of medieval experience has come down to us disproportionately, shaped by whichever version of it happened to rhyme. Where this literary fantasy did occasionally step off the page and into real medieval life was on the tournament field, and here the evidence gets considerably more solid. Knights truly did carry a lady's token into combat, a scarf, a sleeve, a ribbon, tied visibly to armour or lance, publicly dedicating a victory to a specific woman in the stands, usually not his own wife. It was public theatre performed devotion, an entire audience watching a knight risk actual physical injury for the symbolic honour of a woman he was, by the rules of the very same tradition, never quite supposed to have. Crowds gathered specifically to watch this performance play out, cheering, gossiping quietly, noting whose colours a particular knight had chosen to wear that day, information that could travel through a court almost as quickly as the outcome of the joust itself. Compare that for a moment to the small practical gloves and ribbons we spent an entire part of tonight discussing, gifts meant to secure real ongoing companionship between two people who might actually end up married. A ladies' tournament favour promised nothing of the kind. It was gesture without transaction devotion performed precisely because it would never be consummated. Here is a question worth carrying forward with you. How much of what we now consider romantic grand gestures suffering for love, the idea that real love should feel like an ache rather than a comfortable partnership, actually traces back to this particular literary fantasy, dreamed up in aristocratic courts, for people who had almost nothing in common with how ordinary medieval men and women actually fell for each other? We inherited the poetry. We may not have inherited nearly as much of the practical reality underneath it, and yet watch how many modern love songs still lean on exactly this same grammar-longing obstacles, a beloved kept just out of reach, as though 8 centuries of ordinary achievable gloves and ribbons courtship never happened at all. It is worth being honest about the limits of this entire tradition too. Courtly love, whatever its poetic beauty, was built almost entirely around women as objects of admiration, rather than active participants with their own desires being centred. The lady in these poems rarely speaks for herself at length. She exists mostly to be adored, to test, to reward or withhold, favour a role considerably more passive than the working, negotiating, gift-receiving, occasionally law-defying women we have spent the rest of tonight actually getting to know. It is a strange irony worth sitting with. The women who actually appear in medieval court records arguing their own marriage cases, running their own ale stalls, choosing their own suitors at village festivals, come across as considerably more fully realized human beings than the silent, idealized ladies immortalized in all that celebrated poetry about them. I find that particular contrast truly worth remembering whenever this entire period gets flattened down into a single image of knights and ladies and courtly devotion. The poetry was beautiful. It was also in its own quiet way one of the least accurate pictures of real medieval love that this whole story has to offer, which makes it all the more interesting that one particular piece of writing from roughly this same literary world managed to do something rather different. Take this entire tradition of longing devotion and carefully coded romantic gesture, and quietly turn it into something we still celebrate almost without thinking about where it came from every single year. And that is exactly the story we are headed into next. Every single year, somewhere close to $2 billion changes hands across the world in the middle of February, all in the name of a holiday most people assume has been around forever, quietly baked into the calendar since some distant unrecorded point in history. It has not. You can actually trace the exact moment English speakers first started connecting the 14th of February with romantic love, and once you know where to look, the answer turns out to be delightfully specific. It starts of all places with a civil servant. Geoffrey Chaucer spent most of his working life doing surprisingly unglamorous things for a man now remembered as the father of English literature. He collected customs duties on wool exports, spending his days buried in tariffs and shipping manifests rather than sonnets. He served as a diplomat travelling on royal business to Italy and France, negotiating the kind of practical, unglamorous political business we've already spent real time exploring tonight. He sat in Parliament for a while, wrestling with tax policy and local disputes. Poetry for most of his career was something he fit in around the edges of an ordinary busy administrative life, scribbled in whatever hours a working civil servant could steal for himself, which somehow makes what he eventually produced even more remarkable. Around the year 1382, Chaucer wrote a poem called The Parliament of Fowls, and this is where our story properly begins. It describes a dream, a narrator drifting off after reading an old philosophical text, wandering in his sleep into a garden, where every bird in creation has gathered before the goddess Nature to choose a mate, and Nature herself announces that the gathering is happening on St. Valentine's Day. Here is the detail worth sitting with. Before this particular poem, St. Valentine's Day existed purely as a religious feast day, honouring an early Christian martyr with essentially no connection to romantic love whatsoever. Nobody exchanged cards. Nobody thought of the date as belonging to lovers in any special way at all. It was simply one entry among many on the church calendar, no more romantic than any other saint's feast day scattered across the year. Chaucer's poem is widely considered the very first piece of writing in the English language to link that specific date with the idea of choosing a partner. One clever poet quietly working a joke about birds into a dream vision appears to have single-handedly planted the seed for a tradition that would eventually become a multi-billion-dollar industry. Printed cards, flower shops, restaurant reservations booked months in advance, all tracing back, however indirectly, to one man's poem about birds picking mates. Now, why birds and why this particular framing? Some historians suspect the poem was written to mark a truly significant real event, the marriage negotiations between King Richard II of England and Anne of Bohemia, a match that had taken years of careful diplomacy to arrange, not unlike the treaty marriages we spent time with earlier tonight. If that theory holds, Chaucer may have been dressing up a very serious, very political royal wedding in the playful disguise of squabbling birds. And squabble they absolutely do. 3 noble eagles representing the highest ranks of society all compete for the affection of a single elegant female eagle, each one delivering an increasingly elaborate speech about the depth of his devotion, sounding frankly exactly like the kind of overwrought courtly poetry we spent real time picking apart only a little while ago, all longing glances and dramatic declarations of undying suffering. Meanwhile, the lower status birds in the crowd grow visibly comically impatient, muttering that the eagles are taking far too long, that ordinary birds simply pick a partner and get on with the business of spring without all this dramatic speech-making. A duck reportedly grows especially blunt about the whole affair, more or less telling the eagles to stop wasting everyone's time with speeches and simply choose someone already. there is real gentle satire buried in that contrast. Aristocratic love poetry gently mocked by its own poet. Right there on the page, the literary equivalent of watching one group solemnly perform an elaborate ritual while everyone standing nearby quietly checks the time. Here's a question worth turning over for a moment. Does it surprise you that one of the most beloved romantic holidays in the world may have started as a joke? A poet quietly poking fun at the exact same elaborate aching devotion we spent an entire part of tonight taking seriously. And here is the detail I find most quietly moving in the entire poem once you know what came before it in this story. When nature finally turns to the female eagle and asks her to choose among her 3 noble suitors, the goddess does not simply hand her over to whichever eagle spoke most eloquently. She insists that the choice belongs entirely to the female eagle herself, and when the eagle admits she's not yet ready to decide, nature grants her an entire year to make up her own mind, no pressure, no deadline forced by anyone else's impatience. In a poem populated almost entirely by male voices competing loudly for attention, the one moment of genuine authority belongs to the female bird being courted, and the poem treats her hesitation not as a flaw to overcome but as a right worth protecting. That detail did not need to be there. Chaucer could easily have written a simpler, tidier ending. The most eloquent eagle wins, the crowd cheers, the poem closes. Instead, he chose to let the story rest entirely on one female voice's own timing, in a court that would have known perfectly well how rarely real noblewomen were ever granted that same courtesy, and how much real marriage negotiation, the kind we spent an entire earlier part of tonight untangling in painful detail, involved nothing resembling a year of patient waiting for a woman to feel ready. It makes you wonder whether Chaucer, sitting inside a royal court that had just spent years negotiating a politically necessary marriage, was quietly slipping a small subversive wish into the middle of an otherwise playful poem, a fantasy, where a woman's own readiness actually mattered more than anyone else's timeline. Poetry has always been a safe place to say the thing polite society would never quite allow you to say plainly, and this particular detail tucked into a comic dream about birds feels like exactly that kind of quiet rebellion. Chaucer was not alone in reaching for Valentine's Day as a poetic device around this exact moment. Poets close to him, including his friend John Gower and a French poet named Othon de Granson, who moved in some of the same court circles, began using the same date in their own verse at almost exactly the same time, suggesting this was less some ancient tradition Chaucer simply recorded, and more a small tight literary trend. A handful of connected poets in one particular court quietly inventing a holiday, together without fully realizing what they were starting. It is a little like watching a small group of friends invent an inside joke that somehow centuries later the entire world ends up celebrating without ever learning where it actually came from. It would take roughly a century for that literary invention to fully step off the page and into ordinary written life. And when it finally did, it happened of all places inside a family we've already spent a great deal of time with tonight. In February of 1477, a young woman named Marjorie Brews sat down to write a letter to a man named John Paston, the very same family whose household we opened this entire story inside. This John Paston was Marjorie Paston's own brother, the sister whose secret marriage to the family bailiff began our journey tonight. A decade after that particular scandal, here was another Paston sibling caught up in an entirely different kind of romantic drama. Drama this time, one we can read in her own words because her letter survives to this day, carefully preserved among the same enormous bundle of family correspondence that gave historians everything we have discussed about this family across the whole video. Try picturing the moment itself. A young woman, pen in hand, likely by candlelight, composing a letter she almost certainly understood would be read not only by its intended recipient, but quite possibly by other members of both families first, since private correspondence in a house like this rarely stayed entirely private. And yet she wrote with a warmth and a directness that reads even now as unmistakably personal, not merely dutiful. Marjorie Bruce addressed him in that letter as her right well-beloved Valentine and closed another with the hope that he would remain hers. It is as far as historians can determine the oldest surviving Valentine letter, written in the English language, predating printed cards, predating chocolate boxes and flower deliveries, predating the entire modern industry by more than 400 years. Somewhere in a manuscript collection today in careful faded medieval handwriting sits the direct ancestor of every slightly awkward heartfelt card anyone has ever signed in the middle of February since. But here is what makes the letter truly striking rather than simply sweet. It was not purely a declaration of affection floating free of practical concerns. Marjorie's own father was at that very moment negotiating her marriage portion with the Pastons, and the negotiations were not going smoothly, echoing almost exactly the kind of stalled, money-driven courtship talks we already watched unravel earlier in this very family in an earlier generation over an entirely different match. In the very same letter where she calls John her Valentine, she also gently, anxiously addresses the money, essentially telling him that if his family could not be persuaded to accept a smaller sum than they were hoping for, she would rather have him with less than lose him entirely over the difference. Read that intention again, because it deserves a moment of real attention. This was not a woman waiting passively for two families to finish arguing over her future, while she stayed silent about her own preference. She put her preference directly into writing to the man himself in the same breath as her family's ongoing financial negotiation, essentially telling him where she personally stood, regardless of what her father and his family ultimately settled on. That is not the voice of someone treating herself as a passive object being negotiated over. That is the voice of someone actively trying to influence the outcome of her own future, using the one tool actually available to her. Her own words sent directly to the person who mattered most. Sit with that combination for a moment, because it captures something we have spent this entire video slowly building toward. Here in the very first Valentine's letter, English has on record, love and money sit side by side in the very same paragraph, not as opposites fighting for control of the relationship, but as two realities a real medieval woman had learned to hold at once without apparently finding it strange to do so. The romance was real. So was her anxiety about a dowry negotiation that could still even now fall apart the way so many marriage negotiations in this family already had. It is almost impossible not to think of her sister-in-law's mother, Margaret Paston, somewhere in the background of all this. The very woman who once marched her own daughter in front of a bishop over an unsuitable match. A decade later, watching another young woman in her own family write with such open, unguarded devotion about a man she hoped desperately not to lose over a matter of coin, one has to wonder whether any of that earlier lesson had quietly sunk in, whether Margaret herself had softened at all, or whether this new romance simply happened to clear every hurdle. The earlier one had not an approved suitor, a workable if difficult financial arrangement, a match the family could actually be proud of rather than scandalized by. We do not know exactly what Margaret Paston made of her future daughter-in-law's letters, whether she read them with quiet approval or simply stayed out of a negotiation that this time was not hers to control. But there is something almost poetic about the symmetry of it, regardless one Paston daughter fighting her family for the right to marry for love, and a decade later another young woman marrying into that same family, still fighting in her own quieter way for exactly the same thing, only this time using a pen instead of a bishop's court. Here is a question worth carrying with you before we move on. If the very first Valentine on record already contained both love and a negotiation over money in the same breath, what does that tell us about how thoroughly artificial it might be to keep insisting the way we so often do now, that true romance and practical concern for the future are somehow supposed to live in separate rooms? The marriage, for what it is worth, did eventually go through. Whatever the exact terms finally settled between the two families John and Marjorie married and their correspondence afterward, what survives of it reads like two people who truly cared for each other, weathering an entirely ordinary, entirely human set of financial worries along the way. What strikes me most, tracing this particular thread from a bored civil servant's dream poem about birds all the way to one anxious young woman's actual letter, a century later, is how quickly a purely literary invention can turn into something people actually reach for in their own lives. Chaucer never meant to start a global holiday. He was almost certainly amusing himself and perhaps flattering a royal wedding with a clever joke about birds arguing over love on a saint's day nobody had previously associated with romance at all. Within 100 years, an ordinary young gentrywoman was borrowing that same word Valentine to describe the man she truly hoped to marry, money troubles and all. Of course not every medieval romance ended the way Marjorie and John's eventually did, quietly happily on paper, we still have today. For every love story that worked itself out, there were others that ended up dragged into an entirely different kind of paperwork altogether. Disputed, contested, fought over in front of witnesses and church officials by people who could not agree on what exactly had been promised or to whom. And that particular kind of story is exactly where we are headed next. In an archive in the north of England, tucked inside careful modern storage boxes, sit more than 600 bundles of parchment, each one representing a real medieval marriage that fell apart in exactly the kind of dispute we're about to spend the next several minutes inside. Historians call them cause papers, and only in the last few years have researchers finished the enormous task of digitizing and indexing them properly in a joint project between two universities, cataloguing something close to 1 million individual names scattered across thousands of places, some as close as the next village, others as distant as Sweden or Russia, wherever medieval trade and travel happened to carry someone. Which means for the first time in roughly 6 centuries, ordinary people can now search through the actual words medieval men and women used to fight over their own marriages, sitting quietly on a screen instead of buried in an archive few people ever thought to open. Let's step inside that archive for a while and try just for a moment to imagine what it must have felt like to be one of the people whose private heartbreak eventually filled one of these boxes, never once suspecting that centuries later, strangers scattered across the entire world would be quietly reading through the very worst weeks of their romantic life. Every single one of those bundles began the same way an argument between two people usually begins, quietly, privately, long before any official ever became involved. A promise made, a promise later denied. Two versions of the same story, both parties utterly convinced they were telling the truth. What turned an ordinary heartbreak into an actual legal case was the moment one side decided the stakes were too high to simply walk away and took the matter to a church court instead, a decision that was never taken lightly given everything it would end up costing both sides before it was finally over. Here is something worth understanding clearly before we go any further, because it separates this part of the story from everything we discussed a little while ago. There were, broadly speaking, two very different reasons someone might drag a former partner in front of a judge over a broken relationship, and knowing the difference matters, because each one reveals something slightly different about how medieval people actually understood their own promises. The first was enforcement. If you believed you were truly married, that real words of consent had actually passed between you and someone who was now trying to deny it, or worse, quietly marry somebody else entirely, you could sue to have that first marriage formally recognized and enforced. This is in essence the exact machinery Marjorie Paston's own family accidentally triggered when they marched her in front of the Bishop of Norwich, hoping the court would rule against her. It did not, but plenty of similar cases went the other direction, with the court siding firmly against the person hoping to escape forced into a marriage they had truly tried and failed to talk their way out of. The second kind of case looked considerably different, and it belonged less to church law and more to the secular practical world of ordinary contracts. If a couple had exchanged a serious promise to marry an engagement rather than a completed marriage, and one side simply changed their mind and walked away, the wronged party could in certain circumstances pursue what amounted to breach of promise, and in some cases actually recover financial damages through the common law courts, running alongside the church's own system. Think about what that means for a moment. A broken engagement in at least some medieval English courtrooms could be treated with roughly the same seriousness as a broken business contract, complete with a monetary remedy attached to a promise that never showed up to the wedding. It is worth pausing on how strange and honestly how practical that particular legal instinct actually was. Somewhere along the way, English law decided that a broken heart left entirely unaddressed was simply bad policy, that a person who had turned down other suitors, planned a household, perhaps spent money preparing for a wedding that never happened, deserved some kind of remedy beyond simply being told to move on. Turning down other suitors mattered here in a very real practical sense. A woman who had spent a year or more quietly refusing other offers while waiting for a particular man to make good on his promise had lost real opportunity in the process. Opportunity that in a small community with a limited pool of eligible partners might never fully present itself again. The law in its own blunt way was acknowledging that cost. It was not romantic. It was not even especially compassionate in the way we might now use that word, but it was in its own blunt, practical fashion an early acknowledgement that broken promises carry real costs measurable in coin as well as in feeling. Here's a question worth pausing on for a moment. Does it surprise you that medieval law occasionally treated a broken heart as something closer to breach of contract than pure emotional injury? Or does that actually feel oddly more honest than the way we tend to talk about heartbreak now, as though hurt feelings alone were never really quantifiable, when clearly at least once upon a time someone decided they could be? Modern courts still occasionally recognize breach of promise in certain jurisdictions, though the idea has largely fallen out of fashion, treated now as a slightly embarrassing legal relic rather than a serious remedy. It is worth wondering whether we simply grew more sentimental about heartbreak over the centuries, or whether we just got better at pretending money and feelings never mixed in the first place. Whichever type of case landed in front of a judge, the actual mechanics of proving it were almost always the same, and they rested entirely on other people's memories. Neither side had a marriage certificate to wave around, because as we already know by now, medieval marriage rarely produced one. What they had instead were witnesses, neighbours, family members, servants, anyone who happened to have been present or nearby when the disputed words were supposedly spoken. Picture what that actually required of an ordinary person called into one of these hearings. A witness might be asked to recall in precise, careful detail an evening from years earlier, exactly where two people had been sitting, what had been said, in what tone, whether it sounded like a joke or a genuine promise, Whether anyone else in the room had reacted at the time, whether a hand had been held or simply offered. Lawyers representing each side would press the same witness again and again, circling back to small inconsistencies, testing whether a memory held steady under repeated questioning, the way a modern lawyer might test a witness on cross-examination. Memory under that kind of pressure tends to blur and shift the way memory always does, and church court officials seem to have understood this perfectly well, which is likely why so many depositions read less like confident, polished testimony, and more like several different people cautiously, honestly admitting they were not entirely sure, only that something had certainly happened and that it had felt serious at the time. There is something quietly moving about that uncertainty honestly. These were not dramatic courtroom performances the way we might picture a modern trial. They read more often like ordinary people doing their genuine best to reconstruct a moment nobody had thought to write down when it actually mattered, because at the time it had simply felt like two people falling for each other, not evidence anyone would eventually need. A farmhand recalling a conversation by a hearth years earlier was rarely trying to win an argument. He was mostly just trying to be honest about something he half remembered, under considerably more pressure than he had ever expected an ordinary evening from his own life to eventually carry. Historians who have spent years working through this exact material have pushed back hard against an older, flatter way of describing medieval marriage. The version that assumed every single match was a loveless, purely financial arrangement, imposed on a daughter with no input from her at all. The reality that emerges from these actual court records looks considerably messier and considerably more human than that. Financial security and real affection, it turns out, were rarely treated as opposites competing for control of a single decision. They sat together awkwardly but persistently, in case after case the same way we already watched them sit together in Marjorie Bruce's own Valentine letter not long ago tonight. One historian studying consent in these cases has described it as existing along an entire spectrum rather than a simple yes or no. Somewhere between wholehearted, enthusiastic agreement on one end and outright active refusal on the other sat an enormous range of real human responses: reluctant agreement, quiet acceptance, half-hearted resistance that eventually gave way, a slow coming around to a match that had not been anyone's first choice, but gradually stopped feeling like a punishment either. Real medieval consent, in other words, rarely looked like a clean legal checkbox. It looked like real people making real complicated, sometimes conflicted decisions about their own future, the exact same way people still do now, weighing 100 small factors that rarely reduce down to a single tidy yes or no. Here is a question worth turning over for a moment. How often in your own life has a decision that mattered actually arrived as a clean, confident yes rather than something closer to a gradual settling, a slow talking yourself into it or out of it over weeks rather than a single decisive moment? If medieval consent looked messier than the fairy tale version allows for, it might simply be because real consent in any century rarely looks quite as tidy as the stories we tell about it afterward. It is worth noting too that among wealthier land-owning families this entire process seemed to bring out something particularly sharp-edged in everyone involved. Perhaps that should not be surprising given everything we already know about the property, land and family reputation riding on these decisions. When a match involved real inheritance, real alliances, real family, standing the stakes for both sides tended to escalate quickly, and quarrels that might have stayed private in a poorer household instead ended up formally recorded, argued over by lawyers, preserved for centuries, in exactly the kind of parchment bundles we opened this part of the story with. It is more than a little fitting, honestly, that a family like the Pastons, a household we've returned to again and again tonight precisely because they left behind such an unusually detailed paper trail, seems to have spent an entire generation locked in one dispute after another over exactly this kind of thing, marriage negotiations collapsing over money, a daughter dragged before a bishop, another daughter writing anxiously about a dowry that might not stretch far enough. A single family, oddly enough, managing to illustrate almost every shape this entire chapter of medieval life could take. Winning one of these cases, it is worth saying, plainly did not always feel like much of a victory by the time it was finally settled. These disputes could stretch on for months, sometimes years, dragging witnesses back repeatedly to repeat and clarify their testimony. Costing money neither side always had to spare and exposing an enormously private matter to an entire community's scrutiny in the process. A woman who successfully proved her marriage in court had by definition already survived months of public argument over the most intimate moment of her adult life, argued over by lawyers, picked apart by witnesses, judged by an official who had never met either party before the case began. The legal system could hand her a genuine binding victory. It could not hand back the months or the dignity spent proving it in the first place. She walked away legally married and considerably more talked about than she likely ever wanted to be. Here is a second question worth sitting with before we move on tonight. How many modern arguments about texts left on read about who said what during a difficult conversation about whether a promise was really a promise or just words spoken in a moment? Are we still in our own quieter way, running the exact same kind of trial? These medieval witnesses once stood through, just without the parchment and without anyone bothering to write the verdict down. We like to think we have moved past needing witnesses and formal testimony to settle matters of the heart. Most of us have simply replaced the witness stand with a group chat full of friends, cross-examining the same uncertain memory of a single conversation looking for the exact same thing. A medieval judge once was some reliable version of what actually happened and what it was truly supposed to mean. Not every unresolved medieval romance, of course, ever made it as far as a courtroom at all. For plenty of people, particularly those without the money, the connections, or simply the patience for months of formal testimony, there were other ways to try to settle a matter of the heart. Quieter ways whispered rather than argued that had nothing to do with judges or witnesses at all. A man too poor to hire a lawyer or a woman too afraid of the public scrutiny a formal case would bring needed some other way to try tipping fate in their favour, and medieval England, as it happens, offered no shortage of options for exactly that. And that particular considerably stranger corner of medieval courtship is exactly where we are headed next. Not every medieval person waited patiently for a witness to remember the right words or trusted an entire legal process to sort out the future of their heart. Some people, when courtship stalled or affection refused to arrive on schedule, quietly reached for something else entirely. Herbs whispered words, small objects believed to carry a kind of power. No court could ever officially recognize, and no bishop could ever fully stamp out no matter how hard the church tried. Let's talk about medieval love magic for a while, because the real history of it turns out to be considerably stranger and considerably more human than the cartoonish image most of us carry around all pointed hats and cauldrons bubbling under a full moon. Picture an ordinary village healer, the kind of woman, and it was not always a woman who kept a small store of dried plants and half-remembered remedies tucked away for whoever came knocking. Someone might visit her for a headache, someone else for a bad cough or an aching joint that would not settle, and every so often someone would come to her with a different sort of ache, entirely a heart set on a person who had not yet noticed them, or a marriage that had gone cold and quiet, and ask quietly whether there was anything that might help with that too. the same nervous, half-embarrassed way a person today might finally admit to a friend that they have been thinking about someone constantly and have absolutely no idea what to do about it. By most surviving accounts, these village healers, sometimes called cunning women, did not treat that particular request as anything especially strange or sinister. It sat on the same mental shelf as the toothache remedy and the cough syrup, another practical problem deserving a practical, if slightly mysterious, solution. Nobody walking into that cottage was necessarily thinking of themselves as summoning demonic forces. They were thinking of themselves as trying absolutely everything reasonably available to fix a truly painful problem, the same instinct that sends plenty of modern people searching the internet at 2 a.m. for anything that might possibly help a relationship they are desperate not to lose. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you knew with complete certainty that a particular herb worn in a particular pocket or brewed in a particular tea would make someone fall in love with you, would you actually use it? Or does something about that idea feel instinctively wrong the moment you really picture it happening to yourself instead of someone else? The specific ingredients believed to carry this kind of power varied by region, but certain names turn up again and again in English folklore. Vervain, a modest little flowering plant, was gathered and carried for exactly this purpose, believed to sharpen affection and soften a reluctant heart. Fern seed, according to a much older belief, needed to be collected on a very particular night of the year to hold any power at all, tying the whole practice to the rhythm of the church calendar, even while operating well outside anything the church actually condoned. Mandrake, a root famous across medieval Europe for its unsettling, almost human shape, showed up constantly in this kind of folklore, too treated as something between a genuine medicinal plant and a small, slightly eerie object of real fascination, sometimes kept wrapped in cloth and tucked away like a small silent companion rather than simply consumed. There is a certain internal logic running through all of it once you actually sit with the reasoning rather than dismissing it outright. Herbs already did real observable things to the human body, easing pain, calming a racing heart, settling a nervous stomach. If a particular root could truly change how your body felt, it did not seem like such an enormous leap to someone, without our modern understanding of chemistry, to imagine that the right root prepared the right way might also change how someone else's heart felt about you. The line between medicine and magic in a world without any real concept of pharmacology was never as sharp as we now like to imagine it must have been. None of this, it is worth being honest about, was harmless the way a modern horoscope is harmless. Some recipes that survive from this period call for truly dangerous or deeply unpleasant ingredients. And more troubling still, some involved secretly administering something to another person entirely without their knowledge, a filter slipped into a drink rather than a charm simply carried in a pocket. I want to be direct about that particular detail because it is worth naming plainly rather than romanticizing. Convincing someone to love you by secretly altering what they consumed was never a charming medieval quirk. It was by any honest modern standard, and honestly by the standards this entire story has spent hours building toward tonight, a direct assault on the very idea of freely given consent we have circled back to again and again this evening. A love magically compelled was never really love at all. It was closer to theft dressed up in folklore. The official church position on all of this, at least in theory, was total condemnation. And interestingly, the theological objection lines up almost perfectly with everything we have already spent this video exploring about consent. Binding another person's will against their own true feelings was considered by the church's own logic an offense against the very freedom God had supposedly given every human soul. Remember the entire foundation we built a few parts ago tonight, the idea that real consent had to be freely given, or it counted as nothing at all in the eyes of canon law. Love magic sat on the exact opposite end of that same principle. If genuine consent made a marriage sacred, then manufactured consent, forced into existence through herbs and whispered words, represented one of the deepest violations that same legal and moral system could imagine, and yet here is where the actual historical record surprises most people, who assume they already know how this story ends. Picture for a moment the popular image most of us carry around: hooded inquisitors, blazing pyres, women burned en masse across the medieval countryside for exactly this kind of thing. That particular nightmare, as horrifying as it truly was, belongs mostly to a later period than the one we've spent this entire video inside a wave of persecution that would only fully crest centuries after most of the marriages, courtships and letters we have discussed tonight. For much of the actual medieval era, someone caught dabbling in love charms was far more likely to face penance than execution. Early religious law codes prescribed things like a year of fasting on bread and water for giving someone what the texts delicately call something for the sake of wanton love, uncomfortable and humbling. Certainly a truly unpleasant year of restricted meals and public embarrassment, but a world away from a burning pyre. For centuries, cunning folk practicing this kind of charm work were treated less like agents of the devil and more like slightly disreputable healers, tolerated the way a modern doctor might quietly tolerate a patient's insistence on a particular vitamin nobody can quite prove does anything. It was only as the medieval period drew toward its close, and especially once official writings began explicitly linking these ordinary folk practices to genuine demonic pacts, that the mood shifted towards something considerably darker and more dangerous, a shift that would only fully explode into the mass hysteria most of us picture in the centuries that followed the one we're exploring tonight. Understanding that timeline matters because it means an enormous amount of what popular culture assumes about medieval superstition actually belongs to a slightly different later chapter of history entirely, one that borrowed the medieval world's aesthetic without necessarily inheriting its actual, considerably calmer legal reality, which brings us to a case that shows exactly how dangerous these accusations could still become even before that darker era fully arrived, especially once real political power got tangled up in a romance nobody in charge had actually approved. In 1469, a noblewoman named Jacquetta, Duchess of Bedford, found herself formally accused of witchcraft, and the accusation centered specifically on love magic. Several years earlier, her daughter Elizabeth Woodville, a widow of relatively modest standing by royal standards, had secretly married King Edward IV of England himself, an extraordinary, deeply unpopular match that scandalized the political establishment, precisely because it ignored every single rule of calculated strategic royal marriage we spent real time picking apart earlier tonight. No foreign alliance, no careful treaty negotiation, simply a king apparently falling for a woman his own advisers considered entirely unsuitable. A match arranged, as far as anyone could tell, by nothing more official than his own private feelings. Try to imagine the disbelief rippling through that royal court when the news finally became public. Advisors who had spent months, sometimes years, quietly assembling the pieces of a proper foreign alliance for their king, watching all of that careful diplomatic work evaporate overnight, because the king himself had simply gone and fallen for someone during what was supposedly meant to be an unrelated minor petition brought before him. It is precisely the kind of story this entire video has spent hours arguing was rarer than we assume real spontaneous unauthorized affection, winning out over calculation at the very highest level of medieval society, where the stakes for exactly that kind of decision were always steepest. Rather than accept that their king had truly freely chosen a match, Nobody had approved of some of Jacquetta's political enemies found it considerably easier to imagine an entirely different explanation. Surely the thinking went no king would have made such a reckless choice on his own. Someone must have compelled him to it unnaturally through magic, and who better to blame than the new queen's own mother, a woman with both the motive and in the accuser's imaginations the supposed means to bind a king's heart against his own better judgment. Sit with that for a moment, because it reveals something almost as interesting as the accusation itself. An entire society so thoroughly convinced that love and marriage were supposed to follow careful, calculated political logic, that when a real unauthorized love story actually happened right at the very top of that same society, the easiest available explanation was not romance at all. It was witchcraft. A functioning free choice made by an adult king was somehow harder for his own court to accept than the idea that dark magic had been secretly involved. Jacquetta was ultimately cleared of the charge, though not before enduring a formal, deeply public accusation levelled at her specifically because her daughter had married for what looked to everyone watching uncomfortably like real uncontrolled affection. The accusation itself was eventually dismissed for lack of any real evidence, which of course it inevitably would be, since there was never any actual charm to find in the first place, only a marriage. Powerful men had simply decided they did not want to accept at face value. It is worth noting that this was far from the only time in her life Jacquetta faced such an accusation. Political enemies had reason to target her more than once across her lifetime, and each time the underlying anxiety looks remarkably similar. Discomfort with a woman whose family had married unexpectedly well repackaged, a suspicion of the supernatural. Here is a second question worth carrying forward with you tonight. How often do we still do some version of exactly this? Refusing to believe someone truly chose an unconventional partner, freely insisting instead that they must have been tricked, manipulated somehow not fully themselves when they made that particular choice. We may not use the word witchcraft anymore. The underlying discomfort with watching someone freely choose a match we personally would not have approved of looks remarkably unchanged. It is worth adding before we move on that this entire practice was never quite as one-sided as popular imagination tends to assume either. While women bore the overwhelming brunt of both the folklore and the later accusations, surviving records make clear that men sought out these same charms, just as often hoping to win over a reluctant sweetheart, secure a wandering husband's fidelity, or occasionally rather less charitably undermine a rival entirely. Desperation to control the uncontrollable, it turns out, was never particularly interested in which gender happened to be feeling it most acutely on a given evening. A young man nervously slipping a vervain sprig into his pocket before working up the courage to speak to someone he admired was drawing from precisely the same well of folk belief as any woman ever accused of witchcraft for doing the same. There is something worth sitting with in all of this once the whole picture comes together. An entire society spent real energy building careful legal structures around consent, around the idea that love and marriage were only meaningful when freely chosen, as we spent an entire earlier part of tonight, carefully unpacking and running alongside every bit of that same careful legal architecture. Quietly in cottages and market stalls was an entire folk tradition dedicated to circumventing consent altogether, to forcing the very feeling the law insisted could never legitimately be forced. Two completely opposite instincts operating in the exact same villages, sometimes inside the exact same families at the exact same time, each one in its own strange way taking love just as seriously as the other. Not every medieval woman spent her life caught between those two extremes, arranged obligation on one side and desperate forbidden magic on the other. There was one particular stage of a woman's life where medieval law actually handed her something closer to genuine, uncomplicated freedom. Freedom that had nothing to do with charms courts or anyone else's permission at all. And that is exactly where we are headed next. Here is a strange, quiet truth sitting underneath almost everything we have discussed tonight. In medieval England, the single moment a woman gained the most control over her own romantic future was very often the same moment she lost someone she loved. Let's talk about widows for a while, because their legal position turns out to be one of the more truly startling corners of this entire story. And honestly, it is the closest thing this whole video has to a genuine plot twist. To understand why, you first have to understand something about how the law treated married women in the first place, a detail we have mostly stepped around until now. Under English common law, once a woman married, her legal identity did not simply join with her husband's. In a very real, formal sense, it disappeared into his. Lawyers eventually gave this arrangement a name coverture, the idea that a wife's legal existence was folded entirely inside her husband's. She generally could not sue in her own name, could not independently hold property, couldn't sign a binding contract without him standing legally behind her. On paper, in the eyes of the court, a married woman and her husband were treated as a single legal person, and that person was for almost every practical purpose him. It is worth picturing what that actually meant for the daily texture of a marriage rather than simply nodding along as an abstract legal principle. A wife running a household, managing servants, raising children, sometimes even effectively running a family business day to day, could still find herself on paper legally invisible the moment any of it needed defending in a courtroom. Her labor was real. Her legal standing in the eyes of the law watching over all of it was borrowed entirely from someone else. Widowhood flipped that arrangement completely. The moment her husband died, a woman reverted to a legal status with its own specific name, femme sole, meaning quite literally a woman alone. And a femme sole could do almost everything a married woman legally could not. She could own property outright. She could sue and be sued in her own name. She could sign contracts, run a household, manage land. And this is the detail that matters most for tonight's story: decide entirely for herself whether she ever wanted to marry again at all. There is something worth noticing in the term itself. Femme sole was not simply a neutral administrative label filed away in a lawyer's ledger. It carried real weight, real recognition, an entire legal category, built specifically to acknowledge that a woman standing on her own, without a husband's name attached to hers, was still a complete, capable legal person in her own right. In a system that spent so much of its energy defining women in relation to the men around them, fathers, husbands, guardians, this particular label stood out precisely because it defined a woman entirely in relation to herself. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If losing your legal independence was simply the price of getting married in the first place, how differently do you think medieval women might have thought about a second marriage compared to their first? Would you approach a second chance at something more cautiously, once you understood exactly what you were choosing to give up in the process, or would real affection, the second time around, simply have felt worth the trade regardless? This was not simply informal custom, either quietly tolerated but easily overridden. It was written directly into one of the most famous documents in English history, the same one we've already returned to more than once tonight. Buried among its clauses, Magna Carta specifically addressed what happened to a woman the moment she became a widow. One clause guaranteed that she would receive her marriage portion and inheritance immediately without excessive fees or delay, and that she could remain in her late husband's own house for a full 40 days afterward. A formal grace period built directly into the law giving her time to grieve and arrange her affairs before anyone could force her out or assign her dower elsewhere. Picture the practical kindness buried inside that particular clause. Somewhere in a document mostly concerned with taxation, feudal duty, and the limits of royal power, someone thought it necessary to specify that a grieving widow deserved 40 uninterrupted days under her own roof before the world came asking what she planned to do next. The very next clause went further still, stating plainly that no widow could be compelled to marry again so long as she preferred to live without a husband. Sit with that for a second, because it is worth appreciating fully. In a document remembered mostly for reshaping the balance of power between a king and his barons, English nobles thought it necessary to explicitly protect a widow's right to simply say no to another marriage altogether if that was truly what she wanted. Now, the protection came with a catch worth being honest about, because this story rarely offers anything entirely without one. If a widow did eventually decide she wanted to remarry, she generally still needed her lord's consent or the crown's, particularly if she held valuable land directly from him. Complete freedom, in other words, only ran in one direction. Nobody could force her into a new marriage against her wishes, but choosing one for herself still required somebody else's formal approval, an asymmetry that tells you something honest about the limits of medieval freedom even at its most generous. The law had learned apparently how to protect a widow from being forced into someone else's plan. It had not quite learned how to fully release her from needing permission for her own. Still compare that to everything we have spent this entire video exploring. An unmarried daughter negotiated over by her father, sometimes shaped by wardship, before she was even old enough to understand what marriage meant. A wife legally absorbed into her husband's identity the moment she said her vows, and then a widow standing on her own 2 feet in the eyes of the law, for what may have been the very first time in her adult life, fully capable of refusing a second marriage entirely, and fully capable of managing whatever she had inherited without asking anyone's permission first. It is a strange kind of arc when you lay the whole thing out in order like that. A woman's greatest legal freedom in medieval England tended to arrive last after the version of her life, most defined by other people's decisions, had already run its course, not a beginning. Something closer to an unexpected second act arriving only once the first one chosen for her had finally ended. We have actually met a woman who lived exactly this transformation, though we met her earlier tonight in an entirely different role. Margaret Paston, the very mother who once marched her own daughter in front of a bishop who negotiated her own marriage as little more than a calculated exchange of manners, eventually became a widow herself when her husband died in the year 1466. And in the years that followed, Margaret Paston did not fade quietly into the background of her own family's story. She ran the household. She defended the family's properties, at times quite literally against armed men trying to seize them. She wrote furious, detailed letters managing tenants' rents, lawsuits, and family disputes with the same sharp, unyielding authority she had once used to try to control her daughter's marriage. The very same woman who spent one part of her life enforcing the rigid rules of arranged marriage spent the next part of it running an estate almost entirely on her own authority, answering in the end to remarkably few people but herself. Think about how differently we might have understood her if we'd only met her in this later chapter of her own life first. The formidable widow running an estate through lawsuits and armed sieges with nothing resembling a husband's name to hide behind cuts a rather different figure than the anxious mother we first encountered, desperate to control a daughter's marriage before it damaged the family's reputation beyond repair. Both women were the same person. It simply took the loss of her husband for the law to finally treat her the way she had apparently been capable of operating the entire time. It is worth pausing on that particular irony. Margaret Paston never remarried after her husband's death, and given everything Magna Carta had guaranteed her, generations of noble women before her that appears to have been entirely her own choice, to make one nobody in her position could have legally overridden. Chaucer, whose work we've already spent time with more than once tonight, captured this exact tension in fiction through one of his most famous characters, a woman generally known simply as the wife of Bath. She is not a historical record worth being clear about that distinction, purely a literary invention appearing in the Canterbury Tales, but her voice tells us something real about how this particular kind of freedom registered in the medieval imagination all the same. Married 5 times, sharp-tongued, financially independent, and entirely unashamed of any of it, she delivers a long, famously unapologetic account of her own authority within marriage and her own right to seek pleasure and companionship on her own terms. She controls her own money. She speaks her mind in front of an audience of strangers without a trace of the caution we might expect from a medieval woman addressing mixed company. Audiences at the time clearly recognized something in her. Whether they approved of it or not, a widow's particular blend of hard-won independence and open defiance that a father's daughter or a living husband's wife simply was not permitted to display in quite the same way. It is worth asking why a poet would even bother inventing a character like that in the first place, rather than simply writing another obedient, silent gentlewoman the way so much other literature from this period preferred. Perhaps because everyone listening already knew a version of her somewhere in their own community, a widow running her late husband's affairs with a confidence that would have looked scandalous coming from anyone still legally covered by a husband's name. It would be a mistake, honestly, to romanticize widowhood into some secret golden age of medieval female freedom, available equally to every woman who outlived her husband. Plenty of widows, particularly poorer ones without land or dower worth defending, faced real hardship and real vulnerability, the same kind we spent time with earlier tonight when we talked about single women scraping by on their own wages. Legal independence on paper did not automatically translate into financial comfort for a woman with little property to actually be independent over. A widow left with nothing but debts and a handful of children to feed had every bit as much legal capacity to sign a contract as a wealthy dowager, managing several manors and considerably less opportunity to actually use it. Freedom, as we have found again and again throughout tonight's story, tended to scale rather closely with how much land or money stood behind it. Even among wealthier widows, remarriage often happened anyway and not always reluctantly. Managing an estate alone, defending it in court, fending off ambitious relatives eager to control a widow's inheritance could be exhausting, occasionally dangerous work, and plenty of widows chose a second husband precisely because the legal freedom to remain alone did not erase the very real practical difficulty of doing so. The law protected her right to choose. It never promised the choice would be an easy one. But for the women who did hold real property, real dower, real stake in something worth managing, widowhood truly offered something no other stage of a medieval woman's life. Reliably could full legal personhood arriving bittersweetly only after loss. Here is a second question worth carrying with you before we move toward the end of tonight's story. How many of the freedoms we now take completely for granted, the right to manage our own money, choose our own partner, sign our own name to our own decisions, were for a medieval woman only fully hers to claim after everything else about her old life had already changed? We have spent this entire video moving through nearly every version of medieval courtship and marriage. There was secret vows, arranged contracts, market gifts, courtly poetry, court battles, whispered charms, and now finally the strange, quiet freedom that could follow a woman's greatest loss. There is one more thread left to gather up before we close the story properly tonight, A look at everything from all of these different worlds that somehow managed to survive quietly into the lives we're all still living right now. That closing thread is the one we finally pick up now. We have been awake together for a long time now, moving through nearly 1,000 years of medieval England, one small human story at a time. From a bishop's cold stone chamber to a village green thick with the smell of fresh ale, from a wardship contract sold like an ordinary business asset to a widow finally standing entirely on her own 2 feet in the eyes of the law. So before we let this particular night close, it feels worth stepping back for a moment and looking at everything we actually found along the way. Because if there is one thread running underneath all of it, quietly holding together everything we have talked about tonight, it is this. Medieval women were never simply handed a single script and told to follow it. There was no one true version of what it meant to fall in love or marry or refuse to marry in this period. There were dozens of versions running side by side, sometimes clashing directly with one another, depending entirely on how much land your family owned, which century you happened to be born into, and how much your own community was willing to let you decide for yourself. Think about the sheer range of women we met along the way tonight. A gentry daughter in Norfolk quietly exchanging vows with her family's own bailiff, betting her entire future on 2 private sentences the church's own law would end up honouring. A farmer's daughter off working in someone else's household years before marriage ever entered the conversation, meeting suitors across a market stall rather than behind any locked door. A noblewoman whose own wedding day began not with vows but with a financial announcement spoken aloud at the literal threshold of the church property, and affection treated for a moment as 2 sides of the very same doorway. A young woman in a village square accepting a pair of gloves from a hopeful suitor, weighing affection and practical need in the very same breath, never once feeling the need to separate the 2. A duchess formerly accused of witchcraft simply because the court around her could not otherwise explain why a king had fallen in love with the wrong woman. A widow finally standing on her own 2 feet in the eyes of the law for what might have been the first time in her entire adult life, running an estate, defending it against armed men, and answering in the end to nobody but herself. None of those women lived in quite the same medieval world as any of the others, even though they were technically all living through the exact same historical period. That more than any single fact we uncovered tonight might be the real lesson underneath all of it. History rarely hands us one clean uniform story. It hands us a tangle of very different lives, overlapping in time, contradicting each other constantly, and it is our job centuries later to resist flattening all of that into something simpler and tidier than it ever actually was. It is worth noticing too how often class quietly decided which version of this story a woman actually got to live. The higher a family climbed, the more heavily love seemed to get weighed down by land, by treaties, by careful negotiation conducted almost entirely without her. The further down the social ladder you travelled, the more that same weight seemed to lift, if only slightly replaced by different burdens, entirely hard, physical labour, real economic uncertainty, a fee owed to a lord simply for the privilege of marrying at all. Nobody in this story got to choose freely without some kind of cost attached. The only real variable, it turns out, was which particular cost a woman ended up paying: money, autonomy, reputation, or occasionally her own family's approval. Here is something else worth sitting with now that we've gathered every piece of this story together. So much of what still surrounds us every time February rolls around, or every time a couple exchanges rings, or even simply the basic legal principle that a marriage requires both people's real free consent to count at all traces back more directly than most of us ever realized to exactly the world we spent tonight inside. A poet's quiet joke about birds gave us the very idea of a valentine and a young gentry. Woman's anxious, hopeful letter, written to a man whose own family was still haggling over her dowry, Turn that poet's joke into something people actually reached for in their own lives. A church lawyer's careful, centuries-old argument about spoken words gave modern marriage law its most basic requirement, that consent has to be real and freely given, or the whole thing means nothing at all, a principle that still sits quietly at the center of every wedding performed anywhere in the world today. Even a simple word like bridal carries buried inside it the memory of an entire village once selling homemade beer to help a young couple afford their own wedding, an entire community's generosity hiding inside 7 ordinary letters. Most of us have used 100 times without ever once wondering where they came from. Even the small, uncomfortable parts of this story left something behind. The habit of demanding proof of a promise of asking someone to explain plainly what they truly meant by a particular gesture or a particular gift is something we are all in our own quieter modern way still doing constantly, even without a church court or a formal witness anywhere in sight. We rarely think to ask where any of this actually came from. We simply inherit it, use it, hand it down to the next generation without a second thought the exact same way. Medieval people once inherited older customs from the centuries that came before them, rarely pausing to wonder who invented any of it in the first place either. Which brings us back one final time tonight to where this whole story actually began. Do you remember Marjorie Paston standing alone in that cold stone chamber facing a bishop sent specifically to unravel a promise she had made in private? By now hours into this story, you know so much more about the world she was actually standing inside than you did at the very beginning. You know about wardship, about dowries negotiated like business contracts, about the strange legal loophole built directly into her own church's law, the one that let 2 ordinary private words outweigh her entire family's fury. You know she was not some rare exception quietly slipping through the cracks of an otherwise rigid system. She was in her own way entirely representative of just how much genuine complexity was always sitting underneath the version of medieval marriage most of us grew up believing in. Think back too to everyone standing just outside that particular story orbiting around it without ever fully stepping into the light themselves. Her own mother, Margaret, once a bride, negotiated over like any other piece of property, later a widow who ran an entire estate through lawsuits and armed sieges without needing anyone's permission at all. Her own brother John receiving history's oldest surviving English valentine from a young woman quietly worried about her own dowry in the very same breath she declared her affection for him. One single family quietly containing almost every version of medieval love. We spent this whole video exploring arranged and chosen, wealthy and anxious, furious and forgiving, sometimes all within the very same handful of years. It is a strange kind of gift, honestly, that one ordinary family worried about rent and roofs, and reputation happened to write enough of it down for us to still be piecing their lives back together, this many centuries later on an entirely different continent through an entirely different kind of screen. Marjorie and Richard stayed married for roughly a decade until her death. Whatever chaos surrounded the beginning of their story, what came after by most accounts was something considerably quieter, an ordinary household built on an extraordinary beginning nobody in her family had ever wanted for her. There is a particular kind of comfort in that. I think the knowledge that the most dramatic chapter of a life rarely ends up being the whole story. It was simply the loudest part, the part worth remembering, while the quieter years that followed got to simply be lived without anyone bothering to write them down for us to read 6 centuries later. I think about her often. Honestly, the actual moment she must have stood there truly terrified and still found the nerve to simply tell the truth anyway, trusting that the truth alone would be enough to protect her. It usually is not in most centuries, in most situations. It happened to be for her on that particular day because of one small, stubborn legal principle almost nobody else in the room had thought to take quite as seriously as she did. Somewhere in that cold room, a young woman decided that being believed mattered more than being safe, and she turned out to be right, though she had absolutely no guarantee of that when she made the choice. That is really what this whole story has been about, if you boil it all the way down. Not knights, not queens, not even romance in the way we tend to picture it now. It has been about the enormous range of ways ordinary people and a handful of extraordinary ones found to hold on to some small piece of choice inside a world that so often tried to make that choice for them. Sometimes that choice looked like two private words in an empty room. Sometimes it looked like a pair of gloves accepted at a market stall. Sometimes it looked like an anxious letter, love and money tangled together in the very same sentence sent by a young woman who refused to wait quietly while other people decided her future for her. Sometimes it looked like nothing more dramatic than simply outliving a husband and quietly refusing to remarry once the choice at last truly belonged to her alone. If there is one thing I hope you carry with you after tonight, it is this. The next time someone tells you medieval women had no say in matters of the heart, you will know better than most people ever bother to learn just how much more complicated, how much more human, and honestly how much more familiar the real story actually was. They negotiated, they waited, they accepted gifts they could not really afford to refuse. They occasionally reached for a charm nobody could actually prove worked. They stood in cold rooms and told the truth when a comfortable lie was sitting right there easily within reach. In other words, they behaved exactly like people in any century tend to behave when something they care about is truly at stake. Maybe that is the real quiet gift a story like this one can offer this late in the evening. Not simply facts about a world that ended hundreds of years ago, but a small steadying reminder that the fears, the hopes, and the occasional stubborn courage running underneath your own life tonight are not new inventions either. Someone somewhere standing in a cold stone room or a crowded market or a quiet cottage doorway, centuries before you were ever born, already knew exactly what that particular kind of nervous hope felt like. We spent tonight moving from a bishop's chamber to a village green, from a wardship contract to a widow's quiet independence, and underneath every single stop along that journey sat the exact same small human question, repeated in 1,000 different accents, across 1,000 different lives. Who gets to choose? Medieval England never gave one single answer to that question. Neither, if we are honest with ourselves, do we? Thank you truly for spending these hours here with me tonight, wherever you happen to be listening from, whichever city, whichever quiet room, whichever hour on your own clock it happened to be when you pressed play. Stories like this one only mean anything because someone is quietly, patiently on the other side, willing to sit with them until the very end, long after the easier, shorter version of this story would have already finished. It has meant a great deal, honestly, spending an entire evening inside one family's letters, one legal system's strange contradictions, one era's complicated, layered version of love, and knowing you were somewhere out there the whole time, following along in the dark. Whatever brought you to this particular corner of the internet tonight, curiosity, insomnia, a genuine love of history, or simply the comfort of a familiar voice while you drift towards sleep, I am glad it led you here. Rest well tonight. Let the last of tonight's story settle quietly the way a good one always should, somewhere in the back of your mind, ready to surface again the next time somebody insists the past was simpler or smaller or less human than it actually was. And when you are ready, there is always another quiet corner of history waiting to be opened, another story from another century, Another family whose letters or court records or half-forgotten love happen to survive against every reasonable odd whenever you would like to return and listen again.